Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to explore one of the most talked about cases in American true crime history. A story that divided a nation. A tale of marriage, ambition, betrayal, and ultimately tragedy. This is the story of Betty Broderick, a woman who seemed to have everything until she lost it all. Elizabeth N. Bisceglia was born on a crisp November day in 1947 in the comfortable suburbs of Bronxville, New York. She was the third of 6 children in a strict Catholic family. Her father, Frank, owned a successful plastering business, and her mother, Marita, kept a traditional home. The Bisceglia household was one of order and expectation. There were rules to follow, traditions to uphold, and a clear path laid out for the girls in the family. Betty, as she was called, grew up knowing exactly what was expected of her. She would attend Catholic schools. She would be careful with dating. She would find a good Catholic man. She would support him while he worked. And she would be blessed in her later years with beautiful grandchildren. This was the script written for girls of her generation and social class. And Betty, by all accounts, was the perfect Catholic schoolgirl. She bought into the program completely. She attended Maria Regina High School in Hartsdale, then graduated from Eastchester High School in 1965. She was bright, vivacious, with a sharp wit and quick intelligence. Betty had dreams, but they were the acceptable dreams of her time. Marriage, family, a comfortable life. In the fall of 1965, 17-year-old Betty was a freshman at the College of Mount St. Vincent in the Bronx. That autumn, she and a friend took a chaperone trip to South Bend, Indiana, for a Notre Dame football weekend. It was at a party during that weekend that she met Daniel Broderick III. Dan was a senior at Notre Dame, tall, ambitious, intelligent, and charming. He had plans, big plans. He was going to attend medical school at Cornell University. He was going to be successful. He was going to make something of himself. Dan was captivated by the pretty girl from New York. When the weekend ended and Betty returned home, Dan didn't forget about her. He pursued her with letters and telegrams, a courtship that spanned hundreds of miles. The following year, when Dan moved to Manhattan to begin his studies at Cornell Medical School, their relationship deepened. Betty would later describe Dan as very ambitious, very intelligent, and very funny. She recognized kindred spirits in each other. "I am those 3 things," she said. "We were from the same kind of background. We both wanted the same things in the future." Dan asked Betty to marry him repeatedly. Every day for 3 years, she would later recall. Finally, Betty said yes. On April 12, 1969, in an elaborate ceremony in Eastchester, New York, Betty Bisceglia became Mrs. Daniel Broderick. She was 21 years old. The future stretched before them, bright with promise. The early years of their marriage were lean. Dan was still in medical school, and money was tight. Betty worked multiple jobs to support them. She took whatever work she could find, secretarial positions, odd jobs, anything to keep them afloat while Dan pursued his education. She wore second-hand clothes while Dan, always conscious of appearances, dressed fashionably. On the Cornell campus, he became known as Dapper Dan. Betty didn't mind. This was the bargain. She supported him now, and later they would reap the rewards together. In January of 1970, their first daughter, Kimberly, was born. Then in July of 1971 came their second daughter, Lee. Betty was now juggling motherhood with work, still putting Dan through school. But Dan's ambitions were growing. After completing his medical degree, he made a decision that would add years to Betty's role as primary breadwinner. He wanted to go to law school, not just any law school, Harvard Law School. He wanted to become a medical malpractice attorney. combining his medical knowledge with legal expertise. Betty supported this decision. After all, this was their plan. Sacrifice now, prosperity later. She continued working. She continued caring for their young daughters. She continued holding their life together while Dan studied in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In 1973, the Brodericks moved to San Diego, California. Dan had completed his education, both medical school and law school, and it was time to begin building the life they had always talked about. Dan joined a prestigious law firm specializing in medical malpractice cases, and slowly, steadily, their fortunes changed. In 1976, their first son, Daniel Jr., was born. Then in 1979, their youngest child, Rhett, named after Rhett Butler from Gone with the Wind, Dan's favorite movie, completed their family of 6. The money began flowing in. Dan was brilliant in the courtroom, and his cases brought substantial settlements. The Brodericks moved to an elegant home in La Jolla, one of San Diego's most affluent neighborhoods. They joined the La Jolla Country Club and the Fairbanks Ranch Country Club. They vacationed. They socialized with San Diego's elite. Betty, who had worn secondhand clothes and worked multiple jobs, now lived in luxury. She was a stay-at-home mother, active in her children's schools, involved in church and community activities. By all outward appearances, they had achieved the dream. Dan was earning over $1 million a year. They had 4 healthy, beautiful children. They had the mansion, the country club memberships, the social standing. Betty had done everything right. She had followed the script perfectly. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Betty would later say that Dan had begun to change. He spent more and more time at the office, so when he was home he seemed distant, critical. He made comments about Betty's appearance, about their home, little cutting remarks that made her feel she was somehow falling short of his expectations. After years of building their life together, after all the sacrifices she had made, Betty was beginning to feel like Dan was unhappy with what they had built. Or perhaps unhappy with her. In the fall of 1982, something happened that would set events in motion toward an inevitable tragedy. Dan hired a new legal assistant for his firm. Her name was Linda Kolkina. She was 21 years old, the same age Betty had been when she married Dan. Linda had been born in Salt Lake City, Utah, the youngest of 4 sisters in a Danish-American family. She'd worked briefly as a Delta Airlines flight attendant before moving to San Diego. She was pretty, blonde, vivacious, and she was now working closely with Dan Broderick every single day. Betty began to notice things. She overheard a conversation at a party where Dan called Linda beautiful. She noticed Dan was working even later hours. By October of 1983, Betty's suspicions had crystallized into a gnawing certainty. She confronted Dan. Was he having an affair with his young assistant? Dan denied it. He denied it completely, repeatedly. He told Betty she was being paranoid, jealous, irrational. For someone as intelligent as Betty, for someone who had supported Dan through all those years of education. These denials were frustrating, but what could she do? She had no proof, just a sick feeling in her stomach and the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted in her marriage. Dan continued to deny the affair for over 2 years, but in February of 1985 he moved out of the family home, just like that. 16 years of marriage, 4 children, all those sacrifices, and Dan was leaving. Betty was devastated. She was also furious. And then finally Dan admitted the truth. Yes, he had been having an affair with Linda Kolkina. It had been going on for 3 years. 3 years of lies. And now he wanted a divorce. What followed was one of the most bitter, acrimonious divorces in San Diego history. A 5-year legal battle that would become the stuff of local legend, that would eventually make national news, that would divide public opinion and end in bloodshed. Betty felt she was fighting an unwinnable battle. Dan had become the president of the San Diego Bar Association by this point. He was a prominent attorney with connections throughout the legal community. Betty would later describe trying to get a divorce from Dan Broderick as putting a housewife in the ring with Muhammad Ali. She claimed that Dan used his legal influence to make it nearly impossible for her to find representation. The divorce proceedings became increasingly hostile. There were disputes over everything. Custody of the children, division of assets, spousal support. Dan instituted a system where he would fine Betty for various infractions. If she used profanity, he docked $100 from her support payments. If she entered his property, $500. He was using money, the thing he knew mattered to Betty. The thing she had gone without for so many years while putting him through school, as a weapon. Betty's behavior became increasingly erratic. She was a woman watching her entire life dissolve. The identity she had built as Dan's wife, as the mother in an intact family, as part of a successful couple, was being stripped away. And in its place was appearing a new reality she couldn't accept. Dan was with Linda now. Dan and Linda were the couple. Betty was becoming the ex-wife. The bitter, angry ex-wife. She left hundreds of messages on Dan's answering machine. The messages were filled with profanity, with rage, with anguish. She called Linda obscene names. She called Dan every name she could think of. Sometimes she left dozens of messages in a single day. On one occasion, Betty discovered that Linda had baked a Boston cream pie for Dan. She went to Dan's house, let herself in, and smeared the pie all over his bed and belongings. On another occasion, she spray-painted the walls of his home. Dan obtained restraining order after restraining order. Betty violated them. She was jailed twice for contempt. Nothing seemed to make her stop. Meanwhile, the custody battle was raging. Betty had been, by all accounts, a devoted mother throughout the marriage. But now, overwhelmed by anger and despair, she seemed to be unraveling in what appeared to be an attempt to prove Dan couldn't handle single parenthood. Betty began dropping the children off at Dan's doorstep one by one with all their belongings. But the plan backfired. Dan took over as primary parent. He sought and eventually won sole custody of all 4 children. Betty had lost her husband. Now she was losing her children too. In 1986, Dan wanted to sell the family home. Betty refused to sign the papers. Dan went to court, got a judge to sign over Betty's half, and sold the house anyway. Half the proceeds went to Betty, but that wasn't the point. The point was that Dan had taken away her home. The home she had made, the home where she had raised their children, the home that represented all those years together. Betty's response was shocking even by the standards of their already shocking divorce. She drove her car through the front door of Dan's new home. The children were inside at the time. Betty was placed on a 72-hour psychiatric hold. The divorce was finally finalized in January of 1989, 4 years after Dan had moved out. Betty was awarded $16,000 a month in alimony, a substantial sum, but far less than she felt she deserved after giving 16 years to the marriage. Dan retained custody of the children, though Betty had visitation rights. Dan had moved on with his life. Betty was stuck in the past, unable to let go, unable to move forward, and Dan was about to do something that Betty would experience as the ultimate betrayal. On April 22, 1989, Daniel Broderick married Linda Kolkina in the backyard of their home in the Marston Hills neighborhood of San Diego. Linda, who had been worried about Betty's increasingly unstable behavior, had begged Dan to wear a bulletproof vest to their wedding. Dan refused. But he did hire security guards to patrol the event. The wedding went ahead without incidents. Betty didn't appear. Dan and Linda married, exchanged vows and celebrated with friends and family. Then they left for a honeymoon in the Caribbean, just as Dan and Betty had once honeymooned together. For Betty, Dan's marriage to Linda represented a finality she couldn't accept. As long as Dan was just living with Linda, Betty could imagine that it might end, that Dan might come to his senses, that their family might somehow be put back together. But marriage meant this was permanent. Marriage meant Linda had won. Betty would later claim that after the wedding, Linda taunted her. She said Linda mailed her advertisements for wrinkle cream and weight loss products. She said Linda sent her photos of herself and Dan with anonymous notes saying things like, "Eat your heart out, bitch." Whether these claims were true or products of Betty's disturbed mental state, no one can say for certain. Linda's friends said such behavior was completely out of character for her. What is certain is that in March of 1989, 1 month before Dan and Linda's wedding, Betty purchased a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver. She told a friend she bought it for protection. But protection from what or whom she didn't specify. The months after Dan and Linda's wedding were torture for Betty. Her children were talking about Dan and Linda's plans to have children together. The thought of Dan creating a new family, of experiencing the joy of new babies with Linda while Betty's own childbearing years were over, was unbearable. Betty was gaining weight. She felt she couldn't remarry. She felt replaced, discarded, erased. The voices in her head grew louder. Betty would later say that she allowed these voices to completely take over. Friends who spoke to her during this time said she was obsessed, talking constantly about Dan and Linda, unable to focus on anything else, unable to sleep, unable to function. November approached. November 5th would be 2 days before Betty's 42nd birthday. November 22nd would have been 2 days before Dane's 45th birthday. Betty was thinking about death, specifically her own death. She later claimed she had decided to go to Dan and Linda's house to confront them one final time and then kill herself in front of them. Whether this was her actual intention or a story concocted later to gain sympathy, we'll never know for certain. What we do know is what happened in the early morning hours of that November day. It was Sunday morning, very early. The sun had not yet risen over San Diego. The house at 1024 Cypress Avenue in the Marston Hills neighborhood was quiet. Inside, Daniel Broderick and his wife of 7 months, Linda Colkina Broderick, were asleep in their bed. Betty Broderick had been up for hours. She had stolen a key to the house from her daughter Kim's apartment. Now at approximately 5 in the morning, she drove through the dark streets to Marston Hills. She parked. She walked to the house. She let herself in with the stolen key. She knew the layout of the house. She knew where the master bedroom was. She walked up the stairs. Her .38 revolver in her hand, she reached the bedroom. Dan and Linda were sleeping. What happened next took only seconds, though it would echo through decades. Betty opened fire. She fired 5 shots in rapid succession. 2 bullets struck Linda Colkina Broderick. One hit her in the head, the other in the chest. Linda died instantly. She was 28 years old. 1 bullet struck Dan Broderick in the chest as he apparently reached for the telephone. According to Betty's later statements, Dan said, "Okay, you shot me. I'm dead." Then he died. He was 17 days away from his 45th birthday. 1 bullet hit the wall. 1 hit a nightstand. Before leaving, Betty ripped the telephone from the wall so neither Dan nor Linda could call for help. Though by that point, help would have been too late for Linda, and nearly too late for Dan. Betty fled the scene. She drove to her daughter Lee's apartment. She called Lee and asked her to go to Betty's house to check on the younger boys. Betty also asked Lee to get a key to a safe where Betty kept valuables and her address book. Lee went to her mother's house where she encountered police. She told them she hadn't seen her mother and was just there to get laundry. Later that same day, Betty Broderick turned herself in to the La Jolla Police Department. She confessed to the shooting. She said she had not intended to kill them. She said she only wanted to talk to Dan, and then kill herself. She said Linda had cried out, and Betty was startled into firing, but the evidence told a different story. The evidence suggested this was no accident, no moment of startled panic. 5 shots fired, multiple restraining orders violated, months of threatening phone messages, a gun purchased months in advance. 5 days after the murders, over 600 people attended the funeral for Dan and Linda Broderick at St. Joseph's Cathedral. Linda's wooden coffin was covered in white roses. Dan's was covered in red roses. They were buried together, side by side in matching coffins. In death, they would not be separated. The question everyone was asking was why? Why had Betty Broderick, a mother of 4, a woman who had once seemed to have everything, committed such a horrific act? Betty Broderick's first trial began in October of 1990, almost a year after the murders. Her defense team argued that she had suffered years of psychological abuse at Dan's hands. They presented Betty as a woman who had been driven to the breaking point by an unfair divorce, by a powerful ex-husband who used his legal connections to destroy her, by years of emotional torment. Betty took the stand in her own defense. She testified that she had no memory of pulling the trigger. She claimed she had only wanted to talk to Dan, to make him see what he had done to her, to their family. She maintained that she had planned to kill herself in front of him. The gun going off, she said, was almost an accident. The prosecution presented a very different picture. They played the messages Betty had left on Dan and Linda's answering machine, message after message, filled with profanity, with threats, with venom. They presented evidence of Betty's pattern of violating restraining orders, of stalking Dan and Linda, of harassment that had gone on for years. They presented this as a calculated murder by a vengeful woman who could not accept that her ex-husband had moved on. Betty's two eldest daughters took the stand. The family was divided. Some supported Betty, believing she had been driven to this by Dan's actions. Others believed she was a cold-blooded killer who had executed two people as they slept. After days of deliberation, the jury was hung. Two jurors held out for manslaughter, citing lack of intent. Judge Thomas J. Whelan declared a mistrial. Betty would have to be tried again. The second trial began in September of 1991. It followed much the same pattern as the first. The same attorneys, the same evidence, the same testimonies. But this time, the jury reached a verdict. On December 11, 1991, Elizabeth Ann Broderick was found guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted. Betty sat with what some described as a smile on her face. Her attorney tried to paint this as Betty being a social people-pleaser, unable to control her facial expressions even in moments of crisis. The prosecution said it showed her lack of remorse. In February of 1992, Betty was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 15 years to life, plus 2 additional years for illegal use of a firearm. The maximum sentence under California law, 32 years to life. Betty Broderick had killed the father of her children. She had made her 4 children orphans of her own making, and now she would spend the rest of her life in prison. Betty Broderick was sent to the California Institution for Women in Chino, California, where she remains to this day. She became prisoner number W42477. Her children were left to pick up the pieces. Kim and Lee were legal adults by the time of the murders. But Daniel Jr. was 13 and Rhett was just 10 years old. They went to live with Dan's brother and his ex-wife. The family was shattered, divided over the years. They would give interviews, write books, appear on talk shows, each processing the trauma in their own way. Kim, the eldest, testified against her mother's release at parole hearings. She wrote a book called Betty Broderick, My Mom. The Kim Broderick story, describing the toll their mother's obsession with vengeance had taken on the family. Kim said visiting her mother in prison was the worst heartache and sorrow I could ever imagine outside of losing her father. Lee, the second daughter, took a different view. She testified in support of her mother at parole hearings. She said Betty deserved a second chance. She offered to let Betty live with her if released. Daniel Jr. believed his mother was still hung up on justifying what she did, and shouldn't be released. He said, "In my heart, I know my mother is a good person, but along the way she got lost. Releasing a lost person into society could be a dangerous mistake." Rhett, the youngest, appeared on Oprah's show and said he wasn't surprised by what his mother had done. "I kind of suspected something bad would happen," he said. He believed his mother should be released. "She's not a danger to society," he said. "The only 2 people she was a danger to are dead." Betty's case became a cultural phenomenon. 2 made-for-TV movies were produced starring Meredith Baxter. Multiple books were written. The case appeared on countless true crime shows. In 2020, the 2nd season of the series Dirty John was dedicated to Betty's story. People remained fascinated by the case and divided. Some saw Betty as a villain, a narcissistic, vengeful woman who murdered 2 people in cold blood because she couldn't handle rejection. They pointed to her comfortable alimony, her visitation rights with her children, her options for rebuilding her life. They said she had choices, and she chose murder. Others saw Betty as a victim, a woman from a different generation who had given the best years of her life to a man who discarded her for a younger model. They saw a woman who had been systematically destroyed by a powerful ex-husband who used the legal system as a weapon. They saw a woman pushed beyond the limits of her endurance, who snapped under pressures that would have broken anyone. The truth, as it often is, may lie somewhere in between. Betty Broderick became eligible for parole in 2010. By then, she had been in prison for 21 years. She appeared before the parole board, and in her statement, she seemed to have learned little. She continued to blame Dan and Linda for what had happened. She said, "I allowed the voices in my head to completely take over. I took the lives of 2 wonderful people who were loved by many." But when pressed for details, she repeated what she had said at trial. "Linda came at me and the gun went off." The parole board was not impressed. One commissioner told her, "Your heart is still bitter, and you are still angry." Her parole was denied. In 2017, Betty appeared before the parole board again. Again, her request was denied. Richard Sachs, a deputy district attorney who handled the hearing, said, "Betty Broderick is an unrepentant woman. She has no remorse and zero insight into the killings. She just basically said they drove me to do this." Betty wrote letters from prison maintaining that she had been a victim of domestic abuse, a psychological coercion, of a system stacked against women of her generation. She wrote, "This was a case of domestic abuse, a pattern of coercive control that lasted throughout our marriage until the day I killed them." But the parole board saw things differently. They saw a woman who still blamed everyone but herself. A woman who showed no real remorse. A woman who, even after decades in prison, hadn't developed insight into her action. Betty Broderick will not be eligible for parole again until 2032. At that time, she will be 84 years old. She has now been in prison for over 3 decades. She has been incarcerated longer than she was married to Dan. Her children have grown, married, had children of their own, grandchildren she can only see in a prison visiting room, a life she can only glimpse from behind bars. The case of Betty Broderick raises uncomfortable questions. Questions about marriage and sacrifice, about power imbalances in relationships, about the legal system and its treatment of women, particularly women of a certain generation, about mental health and how we recognize and treat psychological breakdown, about domestic abuse, not just physical abuse, but emotional, psychological, financial abuse. Was Betty Broderick an abused woman who finally fought back? Or was she an abuser herself who couldn't accept losing control? Did Dan Broderick systematically destroy his ex-wife? Or was he simply trying to protect himself and his new wife from a dangerous stalker? Were both things true at the same time? What's clear is that this was a tragedy with no winners. Dan Broderick, a brilliant attorney with a successful career, never got to see his children grow up, never got to build the life with Linda that they had planned. He died at 44, cut down in his own bed. Linda Colkina Broderick, who had everything to look forward to, who had just married the man she loved, who wanted nothing more than to be a wife and mother, died at 28. Her life had barely begun. Betty Broderick, who had played by all the rules, who had done everything she was told a good wife and mother should do, destroyed her own life and the lives of her children. She traded years of rage for decades in prison. Whatever justice she thought she was seeking, it has eluded her, and the children, Kim, Lee, Daniel, and Rhett, lost both parents that November morning. They lost their father to murder and their mother to prison. They were left to navigate their trauma publicly, their family's dysfunction on display for the world to judge. The case of Betty Broderick serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when relationships go toxic, when communication breaks down entirely, when hurt and anger are allowed to fester and grow until they consume everything in their path. It's a reminder that no one wins in these situations, that violence never solves anything, that there are always other choices, even when it doesn't feel that way. Today, Betty Broderick sits in her cell at the California Institution for Women. Dan and Linda Broderick rest in their graves at Greenwood Memorial Park, and 4 children continue to live with the consequences of that November morning in 1989. The story of Betty Broderick is one of the most famous true crime cases in modern American history. It's been dramatized, debated, analyzed, and discussed for over 3 decades. People will likely continue arguing about it for years to come, because at its heart, it's a very human story about very human emotions, love, ambition, betrayal, anger, and the terrible things people can do when those emotions spiral out of control. May this story serve as a reminder to choose differently, to seek help when relationships become toxic, to walk away before rage becomes action, to remember that no matter how justified our anger feels, violence is never the answer. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're going to explore a case that shook Italy to its core. A story about love, deception, and unimaginable betrayal. So as we settle in, let me tell you about Giulia Tramontano. In the spring of 2023, Senego was like many small Italian towns near Milan. Quiet streets, familiar faces, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's routines. This was home to Giulia Tramontano, a 29-year-old woman originally from Naples who had relocated north 5 years earlier for love. Giulia had been born on May 2nd, 1994, in Naples into a close-knit family. Her father, Franco, owned a wedding fashion agency specializing in bridal wear and men's formal attire. Her mother, Loredana Femiano, raised Giulia alongside her sister Chiara, who was pursuing her PhD, and her brother Mario. Those who knew Giulia described her as someone who moved through life gently, almost on tiptoes. She didn't demand attention, she simply existed with a quiet grace that drew people to her. After completing her education, Giulia worked in the real estate sector, eventually becoming a reservation manager at Contempora Serviced Apartments in Milan. She was good at her job, organized, professional, reliable, but her real focus as 2023 began was on preparing for motherhood. By May, Giulia was 7 months pregnant, with a baby boy she and her partner had named Tiago. The nursery was being prepared. Baby clothes had been purchased. In March, they'd even hosted a gender reveal party, popping a balloon that released blue confetti while family and friends cheered. In that video, Giulia glowed with anticipation, her hand resting on her growing belly, her smile wide and genuine. The father of her child was Alessandro Impadiario, a 30-year-old bartender at one of Milan's most prestigious venues, the Armani Bamboo Bar. Handsome, charming, well-dressed in the tailored style required by his upscale workplace. Alessandro seemed like the perfect partner. He already had one child from a previous relationship, and to Giulia, he appeared ready to embrace fatherhood again. They shared an apartment in Senego, a modest space where they built what Giulia believed was their future together. But underneath the surface of their seemingly normal life, Alessandro was constructing something else entirely, a web of lies so intricate, so carefully maintained, that when it finally unraveled, the consequences would be fatal. To understand what happened to Giulia, we need to understand who Alessandro Impagnatiello really was beneath the polished exterior. While Giulia was planning a nursery and choosing baby names, Alessandro was living a completely separate existence. At the Armani Bamboo Bar, where he worked, mixing drinks for wealthy clientele, he had begun a relationship with a colleague, a 23-year-old woman of Italian-English heritage. Let's call her AC, as that's how she's been identified in court documents to protect her identity. The relationship with AC had started sometime in early 2021, initially as friendship between co-workers, then evolving into something more. But here's the crucial detail. AC had no idea Giulia existed. From the very beginning, Alessandro had told AC that he was single, available, interested in building a future with her. Alessandro's ability to maintain these two separate worlds was remarkable in its thoroughness and chilling in its calculation. He would tell Giulia he was working late, then spend evenings with AC. He created entirely fabricated stories for each woman about where he was, what he was doing, who he was with. Neither woman had any reason to suspect the other existed. Then AC became pregnant. This should have been the moment Alessandro's carefully constructed lies collapsed. But instead of telling the truth, he doubled down. He convinced AC to terminate the pregnancy, using various manipulations and reassurances. She made the difficult decision to have an abortion, a choice she would later describe in court as the most painful of her life. Meanwhile, Giulia was also pregnant, unknowingly carrying her child at the same time. Alessandro was dealing with AC's pregnancy. As Giulia's belly grew and the reality of impending fatherhood became unavoidable, Alessandro faced a problem. He couldn't keep both relationships going once Giulia gave birth. The evidence of his lies would be impossible to hide, so he began to search for solutions. In late 2022, around December, Alessandro started researching rat poison online. He looked up dosages. He searched for information about how much would be needed to harm a person, how to administer it without detection, how long it would take to work. He researched whether poison could cause a miscarriage. and then he started putting the poison in Julia's food. Julia began experiencing terrible stomach pains. She felt nauseous, weak, as though something was fundamentally wrong with her body. She confided in friends that she felt like she'd been drugged, though she never suspected Alessandro. The idea that the man she loved, the father of her child, could be slowly poisoning her was simply unthinkable. But the poison didn't work the way Alessandro hoped. Julia remained pregnant, the baby continued to develop, and time was running out. In April 2023, AC's world began to shift. Small inconsistencies in Alessandro's story started to accumulate. She'd borrow his tablet for a trip, and while using it, she'd stumble upon something in the browser history. Searches for creating fake documents. Digging deeper, she found an Excel file. Images of DNA test templates. That's when AC discovered the fake DNA test Alessandro had created. See, when Julia became pregnant, Alessandro had told AC about it, but he'd framed it as someone else's problem. He claimed that Julia was an ex who had mental health issues, that she'd gotten pregnant by another man during a trip to Naples, and that she was trying to trap him into believing the child was his. To prove his story, he'd shown AC a DNA test proving he wasn't the father, except the DNA test was completely fabricated. Alessandro had created it himself using downloaded templates and image editing. When AC discovered this deception, she was devastated. Everything she'd believed about Alessandro, about their relationship, about the abortion she'd undergone, all of it had been built on lies. But rather than immediately confronting him, she decided to gather more evidence. She wanted to be certain before she acted. By late May, both women were becoming aware of the truth. Julia had started to suspect Alessandro was hiding something. His behavior had become increasingly erratic. He was distant, distracted, sometimes inexplicably absent. On Saturday, May 27th, 2023, AC decided it was time for the truth to come out. She reached out to Julia directly and suggested they meet that afternoon at the Armani bar where Alessandro worked. Can you imagine that moment? Two women, both deceived by the same man, meeting to piece together the puzzle of their shared betrayal. Julia agreed to meet. That afternoon, she traveled to the Armani Hotel in Milan. She walked into the elegant bar, where Alessandro served expensive cocktails to Milan's elite. And there she met AC face to face. The two women talked. They compared notes. They shared stories, timelines, photographs. And slowly the full scope of Alessandro's deception became clear. He hadn't just lied to one of them. He'd constructed entirely separate realities for each. They called Alessandro, telling him they were together and inviting him to join them. But he didn't come. Instead, he left work and disappeared. Julia and AC continued their conversation until about 6:45 p.m. And those hours, something unexpected happened. Rather than turning on each other, the two women found solidarity in their shared experience. AC later sent Julia voice messages, urging her to protect herself and her baby, expressing regret over her own abortion, warning Julia about Alessandro's capacity for deception. In one particularly poignant message, AC said, "Please save yourself as soon as you can. Protect yourself and your child. If I had chosen to keep the baby, I would be in your same situation now. He would have had 2 children with 2 different women at the same time." Julia responded with her own plans. In a message to a friend, she said she was ready to start a new life without Alessandro. Alone with her baby, she would return to Naples, to her family. She would raise Tiago herself. That evening, Julia returned home to the apartment she shared with Alessandro in Senegal. At 9:43 p.m., she sent a final message to her mother, saying goodnight and telling her to rest well. That was the last anyone would hear from Julia Tramontano. What happened next took place in the privacy of the apartment Julia shared with Alessandro. The full details only emerged later through forensic evidence and Alessandro's own confession. When Julia returned home that evening, Alessandro was waiting for her. According to his later testimony, they began to talk. Julia confronted him about everything she'd learned. The lies, the other woman, the fake DNA test, the poisoning she'd endured without understanding what was happening to her. Alessandro would later describe this conversation in chillingly detached terms. He said he felt stressed. He said when his castle of lies collapsed and Julia discovered everything, "I saw defeat and I hit Julia." But the forensic evidence tells a more brutal story. At some point during their conversation, Julia was in the kitchen area, cutting vegetables with a knife. Alessandro waited, and then, as she turned away from him, perhaps returning to the kitchen, perhaps simply moving through their home, he attacked. The first stab wound was to her back. Julia had no time to defend herself. The medical examiner would later confirm that there were no defensive wounds on her body, no signs that she had the opportunity to fight back or protect herself. Alessandro struck 37 times in total, primarily targeting her neck and chest. The autopsy would reveal that both Julia and the baby she was carrying, little Thiago at 7 months of gestation, had significant amounts of rat poison in their systems. Alessandro's months-long attempt to cause a miscarriage had failed to prevent the pregnancy, but the poison had been there all along, slowly accumulating in both their bodies. After killing Julia, Alessandro faced a new problem: what to do with her body. The apartment was covered in blood despite his attempts to contain the scene. Forensic investigators would later use luminol, a chemical that makes blood glow even after cleaning attempts, to reveal the full extent of what had happened. Blood was everywhere, on the floors, on the furniture, in the car. Alessandro made multiple attempts to dispose of Julia's body. First, he tried to burn it in the bathtub using denatured alcohol. When that failed, he wrapped the body and moved it to the garage, attempting again to burn it, this time using gasoline. Both attempts were unsuccessful. At some point during these horrific hours, Alessandro's phone rang. It was AC, checking in via video call. Alessandro answered, chatting casually while Julia's body was hidden nearby. He lied about Julia's whereabouts, maintaining his composure while surrounded by evidence of murder. The next day was Sunday, May 28th. Alessandro went to work at the Armani bar as scheduled, serving drinks and making conversation as though nothing had happened. Julia's body was hidden in his car's trunk during his shift. After work, Alessandro did something that would later strike investigators as particularly disturbing. He drove to his mother's house for lunch, with Julia's body still in the trunk. He sat down to a family meal, made conversation, acted normally, all while his murdered girlfriend and unborn son were meters away in his vehicle. Later that Sunday afternoon, Alessandro went to the police station and filed a missing person report. He claimed Julia had simply left, that he'd last seen her that morning in bed wearing her pajamas when he departed for work. He suggested she might have run away, might be having some kind of mental health crisis. He even provided police with a fake address where they might look for her. Julia's family knew immediately that something was wrong. Her sister Chiara contacted the television program Chio La Vista, who has seen them. That very evening, desperate for help finding her sister, Julia's phone was no longer active. She wasn't responding to messages. For a woman 7 months pregnant who was always in close contact with her family, this disappearance was completely out of character. The investigation moved quickly. Police found biological traces of Julia's blood in Alessandro's car. His story about last seeing her Sunday morning contradicted other evidence. His behavior was increasingly suspicious, and investigators pressed him harder during questioning. Between May 31st and June 1st, just days after filing the missing persons report, Alessandro's carefully maintained facade finally crumbled completely. At 2:30 in the morning on June 1st, he confessed. He admitted to killing Julia. He provided investigators with instructions on where to find her body, and hours later, in a patch of grass near a garage, hidden in a small cavity just meters from where they'd lived together, police recovered the remains of Julia Tramontano and her unborn son, Tiago. The condition of the body reflected Alessandro's desperate attempts at disposal. The failed burning, the hiding, the moving from location to location. It was a grim end to a life that had been full of hope just days earlier. Alessandro was charged with aggravated voluntary homicide with premeditation, cruelty, and the circumstance of killing a cohabitant. Additional charges included non-consensual termination of pregnancy for killing the unborn Tiago and concealment of a corpse. The trial began in January 2024, nearly 8 months after Julia's murder. Alessandro Impagliato, detained in Milan's San Vittore prison since his arrest, appeared in court to face justice. In his opening statement to the court, Alessandro made what many found to be a shocking admission, devoid of genuine remorse. "When I decided to kill Julia," he told Judge Angela Minerva, "I didn't feel anger or desire for revenge. I decided to do it for no real reason. I was just stressed. Just stressed." as though murdering your pregnant girlfriend and unborn child was a response to everyday pressure rather than a calculated act to preserve a lie. Throughout the trial, more disturbing details emerged. The gender reveal video from March was shown in court. Alessandro and Giulia smiling and laughing as they discovered they were having a boy, while Alessandro had already been poisoning her for months. AC testified, shielded behind a screen to protect her identity. She wept as she recounted the deceptions, the fake DNA test, the abortion she'd undergone, and the guilt she felt about not realizing the truth sooner. She described how just 7 days before the murder, she'd celebrated her birthday with Alessandro. They'd filmed a video together, joking and happy, with Alessandro declaring to the camera, "By September I hope to be officially engaged to her." Giulia's mother, Loredana, testified about her daughter's character, about the plans for Tiago, about how much they'd wanted a grandchild. "I'm no longer a mother," she said, her grief raw and present. Even Alessandro's own mother testified, sobbing as she spoke. "I wanted to die. I lost my grandson Tiago and also my son Alessandro. I no longer have him." The prosecution argued for life imprisonment, emphasizing the premeditation evident in the poison research, the aggravating factors of cruelty shown in the 37 stab wounds, and the fundamental betrayal of killing someone you lived with and claimed to love. The defense attempted to argue against premeditation, pointing to what they called Alessandro's clumsy behavior after the murder as evidence that it hadn't been planned. They claimed the poison had only been intended to cause a miscarriage, not to kill. They asked for mitigating circumstances to be considered, suggesting Alessandro had acted out of a narcissistic wound when his lies were exposed. Court-appointed psychiatric experts evaluated Alessandro's mental state. They found him to have narcissistic and psychopathic personality traits, but determined he was fully mentally competent at the time of the murder. He showed no signs of mental illness, no confusion, no impaired capacity to understand his actions. He simply chose to kill rather than face the consequences of his deceptions. On November 25, 2024, International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, the Court of Assizes of Milan delivered its verdict. Alessandro Impagnatiello was sentenced to life imprisonment with 3 months of daytime isolation. The court maintained most of the aggravating circumstances: premeditation, cruelty, and the cohabitation relationship with the victim. They excluded only the circumstance of futile motives, finding that while Alessandro's reasons were horrific, they were motivated by his desire to hide his double life. In addition to the life sentence, Alessandro received an additional 7 years for the charges of concealment of a corpse and non-consensual termination of pregnancy. The court ordered him to pay $200,000 in compensation to both Giulia's father and mother, and $150,000 each to her sister Chiara and brother Mario. The Tramontano family embraced and wept when the sentence was read. Outside the courthouse, they participated in a flash mob against violence toward women, holding a banner with Giulia's photo and the words "Never Again Violence." Alessandro sat impassively during the verdict, his expression blank, making no spontaneous statements. The case went to appeal, as is standard in Italian law. In June 2025, the appeals court upheld the life sentence, but excluded the aggravating circumstance of premeditation, a decision that angered Giulia's family. Her sister Chiara took to social media, calling it a disgrace and questioning a justice system that could find any mitigation in such brutal premeditated acts. In July 2025, Alessandro made one final attempt that many found particularly galling. He requested access to restorative justice, a program meant for offenders who show genuine remorse and understanding of their crimes. The judges rejected his request, finding that he had never shown concrete signs of awareness of what he had done or genuine remorse for his actions. Today, Giulia Tramontano and her unborn son Tiago are remembered throughout Italy as symbols of a broader conversation about gender-based violence and femicide, along with another case that occurred later in 2023, the murder of university student Giulia Cecchettin by her ex-boyfriend Giulia Tramontano's death, sparked national protests and calls for societal change. The municipality of Milan awarded Giulia the Ambrogino d'Oro alla Memoria, a posthumous honor. The municipality of Senago, where she lived and died, created a program of events called Per Giulia, for Giulia in her memory. The Italian rock band Pinguini Tattici Nucleari wrote a song called Migliori, better dedicated to Giulia, ensuring her memory lives on in music and culture. Julia's father, Franco, and her family have become advocates for awareness about domestic violence. They speak publicly about the warning signs, about the ways abusers manipulate and deceive, about the importance of believing women when they report feeling unsafe. The case revealed something important about the nature of violence against women. It often doesn't look the way we expect. Alessandro Impagliello wasn't a stereotypical monster. He was educated, well-dressed, charming, employed at a luxury establishment. He could maintain complex lies and present a pleasant face to the world. This is what makes such violence so insidious and so difficult to prevent. Giulia's sister Chiara continues to speak out, rejecting the notion that men who commit such acts are monsters or mentally ill anomalies. She argues, as many advocates do, that these are the products of a culture that doesn't sufficiently value women's lives, that tolerates controlling behaviors in relationships, that fails to take seriously the early warning signs of abuse. If there are lessons to take from Giulia's story, perhaps they are these. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong in a relationship, it probably is. Reach out to loved ones if you feel isolated or controlled, and recognize that abuse and violence don't always look like what we've been taught to expect. Sometimes they wear a nice suit and serve expensive cocktails and know exactly what to say to convince you everything is fine. Giulia Tramontano was planning to become a mother. She was building a nursery. She had a name picked out, Tiago. She had dreams of watching her son grow, of building a life as a family. All of that was taken from her by someone who couldn't face the truth of his own actions. She deserved better. Tiago deserved better. And their memory challenges us to do better, to recognize the signs, to believe victims, to create a society where such tragedies become impossible. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we travel to the quiet farmlands of Iowa, where cornfields stretch toward endless horizons and neighbors know each other by name. This is the story of Ryan Cooper, a devoted father, a third-generation farmer, and a man whose life was cut short in the most unthinkable way. It's a story about secrets hidden behind closed doors, about messages sent in the dead of night, and about a crime that would take nearly 3 years to unravel. So as we settle in, let me tell you what happened on that summer night in Traer, Iowa. Ryan Roy Cooper was born on June 1st, 1979, in Waterloo, Iowa. From the moment he could walk, he wore cowboy boots and played with toy tractors on his family's living room floor. Farming wasn't just what the Coopers did. It was who they were. Ryan's father, Jan, had built Cooper Farms into a respected operation, and Ryan grew up knowing he would one day carry on that legacy. Those who knew Ryan described him as a man of few words, but deep loyalty. He was the kind of person who showed up when you needed help, whether you were a family friend or simply a neighbor facing hard times. In a small town like Traer, population barely over 1,600, that kind of character mattered. Ryan graduated from North Tama High School in 1998, and by his early 20s, he was fully immersed in the family farming business. He loved customizing anything with the motor tractors, snowmobiles, jet skis. His attention to detail was legendary. Every piece of equipment gleamed. Every landscape project was carefully planned. Friends joked that you could always spot Ryan by the phone, clipped to his hip, a headset over his baseball cap, and work boots with his pant legs hanging over the tops. But more than anything, Ryan loved being a father. He had 4 children: Cole, Cade, Cable, and Cortland. 3 were still young when this story takes place, sleeping soundly in their beds, while their father worked late or relaxed in his favorite recliner downstairs. Ryan took his kids on annual trips to Wisconsin in the summer, spent weekends at the Lake of the Ozarks, and never missed a school event or sports game. His sister Michelle would later say that it was clear from a young age that Ryan had a fondness for little ones. Fatherhood suited him completely. By 2021, Ryan had been married to Karina Sue Cooper for several years. They lived together in a farmhouse at 1846 K Avenue, about 7 miles southwest of Traer. The house sat among the fields Ryan worked every day. a place where the only sounds at night were crickets and the occasional rustle of corn stalks in the wind. To the outside world, they seemed like any other rural Iowa family. But inside that house, something had been growing in the shadows. Something that would soon shatter everything Ryan had built. Karina Cooper ran a small barber shop from their home. It gave her independence, a chance to interact with people beyond the isolation of farm life. She cut hair, made conversation, built relationships with her clients. On the surface, it seemed like a wholesome small business, but Karina had secrets. In the months before Ryan's death, Michelle Wilson, Ryan's older sister, who handled the books for Cooper Farms, noticed something troubling. Karina's bank accounts were constantly overdrawn. It happened so frequently that it became a pattern. Karina would later claim it was just forgetfulness, that she had cash from her barber shop, but forgot to make deposits. But the numbers told a different story. Ryan managed the family finances, and he was meticulous about it. Cooper Farms was the family legacy, and nearly all of Ryan's assets were tied up in it. Karina had very little money of her own, and according to testimony that would later emerge in court, she wanted things Ryan didn't think they could afford. Home remodels, a second property, a different kind of life. The marriage looked normal from the outside. When Karina would later testify in her own defense, she described their relationship as good and normal. But normal families don't have one spouse telling witnesses, "I want him dead. I could shoot him in the face." Yes, you heard that correctly. Two different witnesses would later tell police that Karina had said exactly that. Those words would come back to haunt her. But there was someone else in this story. Someone who should have been just another client at Karina's home barber shop. His name was Houston Danker. Houston William Danker was 24 years old when he met Karina. He lived in Schellsburg, about 40 miles from Traer, and he had children of his own. Karina cut his hair. She babysat his kids a few times. In a town where rumors spread like wildfire, people began to talk. Were they having an affair? Danker would initially describe their relationship to police as that of gay best friends, a bizarre claim meant to deflect suspicion. He told investigators that Karina was just someone he talked to occasionally on Snapchat. Nothing more. The rumors in Traer, he said, were just small-town gossip because she cut his hair. But the truth was far different. Karina and Houston were messaging constantly on Snapchat, an app designed to make messages disappear. They chose it deliberately. By early 2021, their conversations had turned intimate, then sexual, then something darker. In one message, after Danker sent an explicit text to Karina, she responded, "Here's hoping for a rogue semi today. Big accident, no survivors." She was talking about Ryan, wishing for him to die in a trucking accident. The messages continued. They talked about being together, about getting married, and having children. Never mind that Karina had her tubes tied, making more children impossible. Never mind that they were both already parents. This was a fantasy they were building together. Message by message in the dead of night while their family slept. But fantasies, no matter how elaborate, require something to make them real. And Karina stood to inherit something valuable if Ryan died. Over $500,000 in life insurance policies. In the months leading up to June 2021, their messages took on a more sinister tone. They weren't just wishing Ryan would die in an accident anymore. They were making plans. June 17th, 2021 was a Thursday. Summer in Iowa when the days are long and humid, and the sun doesn't set until well after 8 p.m. Ryan and Karina returned home that evening around 8 o'clock. Their three youngest children were upstairs, settling in for the night. Ryan, as he often did, got comfortable in his favorite recliner in the living room. It was his spot, the place where he could finally relax after a long day of farming. What Ryan didn't know was that his phone had been tracked all evening, that his wife had been messaging someone, that plans set in motion months earlier were now reaching their final terrible conclusion. At 9:04 p.m., Houston Danker's phone pinged near the Cooper residence. It passed by again at 9:25 p.m., and once more at 9:40 p.m., 3 times within an hour, driving past the farmhouse. Inside the house, Ryan had fallen asleep in his recliner, around 3:30 in the morning when the world was at its darkest and quietest. Snapchat messages began flying between Karina and Houston. The content of these messages would later chill investigators. "Remember those casings? Fucking remember those. No ifs, ands, or buts, Danker wrote. Less than 15 seconds later, Karina responded absolutely 100%. Okay, babe. Seriously putting the phone down, Danker wrote back. Have to get this shit done. Minutes passed. The house remained silent except for the sound of Ryan's breathing as he slept in his chair. Then 2 shots rang out. Both bullets struck Ryan on the left side of his face, fired at close range from a .22 caliber rifle. The medical examiner would later testify that either wound would have been independently fatal, meaning either shot alone could have killed him. The bullets penetrated his skull and brain. There were stippling marks on his skin, indicating the gun had been within a few feet of him when it was said. Ryan never woke up. He never moved. He never had a chance. One .22 shell casing was found on the floor near the recliner, but no gun was anywhere near Ryan's body. The second casing was never found, possibly having fallen into a nearby floor vent, or possibly removed from the scene entirely. Blood pooled around the recliner. Forensic analysts would later reconstruct the scene, determining that the seldom-used living room door had been closed during the shooting, then opened while Ryan's blood was still wet, leaving telltale patterns on the door itself. Upstairs, 3 children slept through their father's murder. At 4:35 a.m., a 911 call came into the Tama County Sheriff's Office. Someone had been shot at 1846 K Avenue in Trier. The records don't specify exactly who made that call, but when Deputy Kyle Fangman arrived at the scene 7 minutes later, he found something that would haunt everyone who saw it. Ryan Cooper's body was still in the recliner, his face destroyed by the 2 gunshots, and Karina Cooper was sitting on top of him, not beside him, not kneeling next to him. She was sitting on top of her dead husband's body, rubbing her face against his bloodied face. Deputy Fangman asked her to step outside. Karina and the 3 children who had been in the house were taken out onto the lawn while investigators began processing what was clearly a homicide. But Karina's behavior was already raising red flags. Forensic bloodstain analyst Kenneth Martin would later testify that Karina's actions sitting on Ryan's body and pressing her face against his had the effect of disturbing the blood evidence. More specifically, it could have been an attempt to mask gunshot residue on her own face and hands by contaminating herself with Ryan's blood. Karina's placing her hand across Mr. Cooper and hugging him. Martin explained to the jury during trial, Mr. Cooper could have some blood on his face, which could be moving that blood around, which could be changing the appearance of the stain. Was it grief, or was it something more calculated? Before calling 911, Karina had called someone else first. Ryan's older brother, Aaron Cooper, who lived just a few minutes away and was a volunteer firefighter. Aaron would testify that he immediately called 911 himself while pulling out of his driveway to help. When Aaron arrived at the scene and was led inside, he saw what no family member should ever have to see. His brother, dead in his favorite chair. The image would haunt him, leaving him unable to sleep in his own home for the first few nights after the murder. Iowa DCI Special Agent Ryan Herman arrived to interview Karina that same morning, June 18th. At first, Karina told a simple story. She'd been asleep upstairs. She woke up, came downstairs, and found Ryan shot. She had no idea what happened. She seemed genuinely distraught, but then something unexpected occurred. During a break in Karina's interview, Aaron Cooper, who was being questioned separately, told investigators something crucial. He mentioned that Ryan had recently seen a suspicious Snapchat message on Karina's phone. The message was from someone named Houston Danker, and it referenced seeing you naked and mentioned a married woman. When investigators returned to question Karina about Danker, her entire demeanor changed. She forcefully denied any intimate relationship with him. She said the Snapchat incident was a non-issue because Danker had assured her the message was meant for someone else. She claimed he was just a friend she had on Snapchat, that she'd cut his hair and babysat his kids a few times, but that was it, nothing more. The investigators weren't convinced, but they had no evidence yet to challenge her story. In a separate interview that same day, Houston Danker also denied having any affair with Karina. He gave the gay best friend explanation, suggesting the rumors in Trier were just small-town gossip. He seemed calm, cooperative, and not particularly worried, but investigators knew something was wrong. They just couldn't prove it yet. The Iowa Office of the State Medical Examiner performed Ryan's autopsy on June 20th. The cause of death, 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Manner of death, homicide. Toxicology came back negative for alcohol or drugs. Ryan had been completely sober when he was murdered. No gun was found at the scene. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of robbery or burglary. This wasn't a random home invasion. This was something far more personal. The investigation continued through the summer and fall of 2021, then into 2022. Investigators conducted interviews. They obtained search warrants. They collected evidence. But month after month passed without an arrest. Ryan's family knew, from almost the very beginning. They believed Karina was involved, but they couldn't say anything publicly. They had to maintain a facade, had to act normal, because investigators needed time to build what Michelle Wilson would later call an airtight case. The waiting was excruciating. Here's what made this case so challenging. Snapchat. Snapchat is designed to make messages disappear. That's its entire selling point. Send a photo, a video, a text message, and within seconds or minutes, it's gone. For people having affairs or planning crimes, it seems like the perfect communication tool. But Snapchat messages aren't quite as gone as users think they are. 4 days after Ryan's murder, on June 22, 2021, Karina's Snapchat account was remotely deleted. Her phone had already been seized by investigators, which meant someone deleted her account from another device, likely an attempt to destroy evidence. But investigators were already working with Snapchat's parent company, obtaining records, subpoenaing data. What they found was devastating. Detective Tiffany Lord, a digital forensics investigator from the University of Iowa Police Department, spent months piecing together the digital evidence. She recovered thousands of messages between Karina and Houston. Messages that painted a picture of an intense affair. Messages that showed their growing frustration at not being able to be together. Messages that revealed their plans. And then there were the internet searches. On November 8th and 9th, 2020, more than 7 months before Ryan's murder, Karina had searched for common type of handgun bullets and information about which bullets are used in different situations. The November 9th search was performed on a private browser, suggesting she knew these searches might be incriminating. Houston's search history was even more disturbing. On May 11th, 2021, just over a month before the murder, Danker had searched for ways to kill someone. Specifically, he looked up killing someone with antifreeze and sodium sulfate. He researched how to kill someone without them knowing. After Ryan's death, Danker's searches became desperate. In July 2021, he looked up where do murderers go to prison in Iowa, and information about medium security prisons. He searched for how long data forensics take to process. He looked up how to delete Snapchats, how to get away with murder, and the #1 lawyer in Iowa. These were not the searches of an innocent man, but perhaps the most damning evidence was the phone data from the night of the murder itself. Cell phone records showed that Karina and Ryan returned home around 8 p.m. on June 17th, 2021. Karina's phone remained at the residence all night, but it wasn't idle. At 3:30 a.m., messages flew between Karina and Houston. Tower data showed Danker's phone passing by the Cooper residence 3 times, between 9:04 p.m. and 9:40 p.m. Then it went silent for hours. Where was Danker during those missing hours? The prosecution would argue he was inside the Cooper home, waiting for Ryan to fall asleep. The message at 3:32 a.m. from Danker, "Remember those cases, fucking remember those," came approximately an hour before Karina called 911 at 4:35 a.m. The timeline was becoming clear. The evidence was mounting, but investigators needed more. In early 2024, nearly 3 years after Ryan's murder, investigators finally had enough evidence to make arrests. On February 19, 2024, the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation in the Tama County Sheriff's Office arrested Karina Cooper at her residence in Traer. She was charged with first-degree murder. The arrest stunned the small community of Traer, even though many had suspected Karina all along. 3 years is a long time to wait for justice. Ryan's children had grown. His family had grieved in silence, unable to speak about their suspicions. The farmhouse on K Avenue had sat empty, a grim reminder of what happened there. Karina pleaded not guilty. Her bail was set at $1 million. Then, on April 29, 2024, just over 2 months later, investigators arrested Houston Danker in Cedar Rapids. He too was charged with first-degree murder, specifically with acting in concert with Karina Cooper to kill Ryan. According to the criminal complaint, Danker had confessed. He told investigators he planned and assisted Karina Cooper with the shooting death of Ryan Cooper. The details of his confession weren't immediately made public, but it was enough for prosecutors to charge him with the same crime. Danker also pleaded not guilty. His bail was also set at $1 million. Both were held in the Tama County Jail, though Danker would later be moved to Johnson County to await trial. But there was a problem. The trials had to be held separately, and both defendants had the right to remain silent and not testify against each other. The prosecution would have to prove their case without either defendant directly implicating the other on the witness stand. Due to pretrial publicity in Tama County, Karina's trial was moved to Lynn County. It began on July 9, 2025, in Cedar Rapids. The courthouse was packed. Ryan's family sat on one side. His sister Michelle, his sister-in-law Heather, other relatives and friends. On the other side sat supporters of Karina, including her elderly mother Kathleen Alpers, who would watch her daughter face life in prison. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General Israel Kodiaga and Mike Ringel, laid out a theory they called a meticulously planned killing. They presented the Snapchat messages, the phone data, the search history. They showed how Karina and Houston had communicated right up until the moment of Ryan's death, with messages about shell casings and getting things done. They emphasized Karina's financial troubles, the overdrawn accounts, the lack of personal assets, the $500,000 in life insurance policies on Ryan's life of which she was the sole beneficiary. Those policies had been paid out to Karina even as the criminal investigation continued, though she claimed she'd put most of the money in trust for the children. Forensic experts testified about blood spatter patterns, bullet trajectories, and the impossible physics of Ryan shooting himself twice in the face. Criminalists walked the jury through the crime scene photos, the massive pool of blood, the recliner, the single shell casing, the door that had been opened while blood was still wet. One of the most powerful witnesses was Michelle Wilson, Ryan's sister. She testified about finding a phone bill in Ryan's personal files after his death, a bill with a post-it note attached. On the note, in what appeared to be Ryan's handwriting, were the words Huston D and a phone number. Certain calls on the bill had been marked with ticks or slashes. Ryan had known, or at least suspected. He had been going through Karina's phone records, tracking her calls. He was gathering evidence of the affair. Had he confronted her? Had he threatened divorce? What had he discovered in those final days? The prosecution argued that Ryan's investigation of Karina's affair had accelerated the murder plot. It couldn't wait any longer. Ryan was getting suspicious. The defense, led by attorney Nicole Watt, told a different story. She argued that Houston Danker was the real killer, that he had acted alone, and that Karina was a victim of his manipulation. The affair was mostly just an online fantasy, Watt claimed. Not a real relationship. Danker was coercive, controlling, threatening. Karina was scared of him. And then, in a dramatic move, Karina took the stand in her own defense. On July 10, 2025, Karina Cooper testified before the jury. She described her marriage to Ryan as good and normal. She admitted she had financial problems but attributed them to laziness and forgetfulness, not malice. Yes, she had cash from her barber shop, but she just forgot to deposit it sometimes. Yes, Ryan managed the finances, but that was normal for their family. About Houston Danker, Karina painted a picture of an online fantasy gone wrong. She said their relationship started innocently, flirting when she cut his hair, then messaging on Snapchat. It was like going to a chat room, she said, or playing a video game where you steal cars and shoot at people. Just fantasy, not real. They had sex once, in February 2021, and afterward Karina said she felt disgusted. She became scared of losing Ryan and her family. She tried to cut off contact with Houston, she claimed, but he wouldn't leave her alone. Then came her explanation for the night of the murder. Karina testified that Houston had killed Ryan, and that she knew he was the killer, but she didn't tell police because she was terrified. He was threatening her and the children. In September 2021, months after the murder, Danker was allegedly watching her, sending her Snapchats saying he knew where she was and what she was wearing. When prosecutors asked why she didn't tell investigators about these threats during any of her interviews, Karina said she panicked. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. Assistant Attorney General Israel Kodiaga pointed out the inconsistencies in her story. He reminded her of the messages she'd sent. The one about hoping Ryan would die in a truck accident. The one responding absolutely 100% when Danker told her to remember the shell casings. The message sent at 3:37 a.m. saying simply go right before the murder. He pointed out that she'd sat on Ryan's dead body, contaminating the crime scene. That she'd told witnesses she wanted Ryan dead and could shoot him in the face. That she had his tubes tied, making the fantasy of having children with Danker physically impossible, yet she'd let that fantasy continue. Kodiaga reminded the jury of her search history, looking up bullet types months before the murder, searching on a private browser so there'd be no record. And perhaps most damning, when forensic analysts tested a Ruger 1022 rifle found in Houston Danker's possession, the shell casings matched the one found at the crime scene. Karina had no answers that satisfied the jury. She cried. She claimed she was scared, but the evidence was overwhelming. Houston Danker had been subpoenaed to testify, but through his attorney he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The jury never heard from him directly, only through his old police interviews where he'd lied about the affair, and through the messages he'd sent to Karina. On July 11, 2025, after 6 days of testimony, the jury began deliberations at 1:18 p.m. They took a brief break around 4 p.m. due to severe weather warnings. Then at 4:51 p.m., just over 3 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Some people cried quietly. Others embraced. Ryan's family held each other, processing the moment they'd waited 4 years to see. Karina Cooper stood as Tama County Sheriff. Casey Schmidt placed her in handcuffs and led her out of the courtroom. Houston Danker's trial was scheduled to begin on August 12, 2025, in Johnson County. He'd pleaded not guilty and was preparing an alibi defense, claiming he'd been at his parents' home near Trier at the time of Ryan's murder. But on August 12th, just moments before jury selection was set to begin, something unexpected happened. Houston Danker changed his plea to guilty. Standing before 6th Judicial District Chief Judge Lars Anderson, Danker acknowledged that he and Karina Cooper were lovers and had planned Ryan's murder together over the course of 4 to 5 months. He admitted to first-degree murder, confirming that he had acted in concert with Karina to kill Ryan Cooper. The details of exactly who pulled the trigger remained unclear, both during Karina's trial and after Danker's guilty plea. The prosecution had argued that there were 2 possible scenarios. Either Karina was the shooter, or Danker was the shooter with Karina's help. Under Iowa law, it didn't matter. Both were equally guilty of first-degree murder. Danker's guilty plea meant there would be no trial, no chance for his story to be heard publicly. His attorney Leon Spies would later describe Danker as blinded both emotionally, spiritually, morally, and said this had led him to help Karina murder her husband. Danker's sentencing was set for October. On September 19, 2025, Karina Cooper returned to the Tama County Courthouse in Toledo for her sentencing hearing. Before the judge pronounced sentence, he first addressed Karina's motion for a new trial. Her attorneys argued that the evidence didn't support the verdict, that the jury had gotten it wrong. Judge Lars Anderson disagreed. He cited the weight of the evidence, specifically mentioning Miss Cooper's relationship with Mr. Danker and the messages with Mr. Danker, both before and particularly the night and morning of the murder, messages which directly implicate Miss Cooper in Ryan Cooper's death. The motion for a new trial was denied. Then came the victim impact statements. Heather Cooper, Ryan's sister-in-law, spoke first. She and her husband Aaron were now raising Karina and Ryan's 3 children alongside their own. She talked about the horror Aaron experienced being first on the scene, the images that haunted him, the fear that kept him from sleeping in their own home, those first few nights. I forever pray she did not damage them from loving, Heather said of the children. I go places now and it feels different than what once happy memories her and her lover have destroyed. She destroyed so much of a positive future and ruined so much of a past. Then Michelle Wilson, Ryan's older sister, delivered one of the most powerful victim impact statements the courtroom had ever heard. She'd begun writing notes for this moment 4 years earlier, starting the day after Ryan's murder, the day the family learned Karina was responsible. Michelle talked about Ryan's dreams, how from the time he could walk, he played with toy tractors and wore cowboy boots. How he grew into a devoted father who never missed his children's activities. How he worked the family farm carrying on the legacy he'd been born into. The heinous crime was committed in their home, while 3 of the children slept upstairs. Michelle said, her voice strong despite the emotion. No efforts were made by the person responsible to protect his children. She talked about living behind a facade for years, knowing Karina was guilty but unable to speak out while investigators built their case. She talked about the lifetime moments Ryan was missing. Father's Days, family events, his children's milestones. And then, her final words to Karina: "There is no sentence for you that would adequately punish you for your evil, vile, selfish, delusional, and narcissistic actions. I will waste no time and no energy in addressing you about that. My full, complete, and final message to you is, go to hell." Judge Anderson then addressed Karina directly. Mr. Cooper was, by what I heard at trial, a hard-working, kind, generous man who loved his children and his many friends. The judge said, "This was a senseless crime. Your actions, whether you were the one who shot Mr. Cooper or whether aiding and abetting Houston Danker resulted in his death. You deprived your children of not only a father but of a mother. The sentence was mandatory under Iowa law. Life in prison without the possibility of parole." Karina Cooper was also ordered to pay a $150,000 in restitution to Ryan's estate, plus additional amounts to crime victim services. She would provide a DNA sample to the Department of Correctional Services. She would spend the rest of her life behind bars. Karina chose not to make a statement. She was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. 2 weeks later, on October 3rd, 2025, Houston Danker appeared for his own sentencing hearing. Ryan's family delivered similar impact statements, with Michelle Wilson calling both Danker and Karina psychopaths, who had plotted her brother's death like it was just an item on their checklist. Judge Anderson sentenced Danker to the same mandatory punishment, life in prison without parole, plus $150,000 in restitution. Both killers would spend the rest of their lives in Iowa prisons, never to walk free again. Ryan Cooper's 4 children lost both parents that night in June 2021. Their father was murdered. Their mother became his killer. The 3 youngest children who were sleeping upstairs that night are now being raised by their Uncle Aaron and Aunt Heather Cooper. Ryan's oldest child, who was already out of high school when the murder occurred, is making their way in the world without a father. The family created the Ryan Cooper Family Foundation in his memory. It helps families experiencing hard times, the same way Ryan would have helped them when he was alive. Whether someone needed financial assistance or just a helping hand, Ryan had been there. The foundation carries on that legacy. Cooper Farms continues to operate, with Ryan's brother Aaron likely carrying on the work Ryan can no longer do. The fields still need planting every spring. The harvest still comes every fall. The land endured, but the farmhouse at 1846 K Avenue stands as a reminder of what was lost. A reminder that evil can hide in the most ordinary places. That betrayal can come from the person sleeping beside you. That messages sent in the darkness can lead to unspeakable acts. Ryan Cooper died at 42 years old, far too young, with so much life left to live. He never got to see his youngest children graduate, never got to meet potential grandchildren, never got to retire from farming and enjoy the life he'd built. His family was sentenced to life without Ryan. As Michelle Wilson said, "There is no real justice when murder is involved. There is only the small comfort of knowing the killers are locked away, unable to hurt anyone else. The case is closed now." Karina Cooper and Houston Danker sit in separate prisons. The Snapchat messages have been preserved as evidence. The search histories documented. The blood spatter analyzed. The forensic reports filed away. But in a small town in Iowa, Ryan Cooper is still remembered. Not for how he died, but for how he lived. As a father who loved his children. As a farmer who worked his family's land. As a friend who showed up when needed. As a man who deserved so much better than the death he received. That is Ryan's true story. And that's why we remember his name. Rest well. Ryan Roy Cooper, June 1, 1979 to June 18, 2021. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our 4th story. Story 4. In the early morning hours of February 4th, 2015, a Bastrop County Sheriff's deputy was making his routine patrol through a vacant shopping center parking lot in Cedar Creek, Texas. It was around 2 a.m., and the winter air was cold and still. The deputy's headlights swept across the empty lot at 1118 Stephen F. Austin Boulevard, illuminating rows of darkened storefronts at the Shopping Colony Village. Then he saw it. A late-model black Dodge Charger parked behind the shopping center. One of its doors stood ajar, and next to the vehicle on the cold pavement lay the body of a woman. The woman was Samantha Dean. She was 29 years old, and she was 7 months pregnant with a baby girl she had already named Madeline. Her friends and family called the baby Maddie. Samantha had been shot 3 times in the head. Nearby investigators would find marijuana scattered in her car, as if someone had wanted the scene to look like a drug deal gone wrong. But Samantha Dean was no drug dealer. She was a victim services coordinator for the Kyle Police Department, the very first person to hold that position. Her job was to help crime victims navigate the most difficult moments of their lives, to provide comfort and support when everything felt like it was falling apart. She was the person who sat with traumatized families, who explained confusing legal processes, who offered a safe haven in the midst of chaos. Now she had become a victim herself. To understand what happened to Samantha Dean, you have to understand who she was. Born on Mother's Day in 1985, Samantha, or Sammy as her loved ones called her, was described by those who knew her as feisty, rambunctious, smart, independent, loyal, and compassionate. She was someone who packed more life into her 29 years than most people manage in 70. But Samantha's path to that parking lot in Bastrop began years earlier with a battle that would have defeated many others. While she was still young, Samantha was diagnosed with sarcoma, a rare and aggressive form of cancer that attacked her elbow. The treatment was brutal. She endured intensive radiation therapy and multiple extensive surgeries. The cancer was in her arm, and the treatment left permanent damage. Samantha had dreamed of becoming a police officer. She wanted to wear the uniform, carry the badge, serve and protect, but the physical damage from her cancer treatment made that impossible. She couldn't pass the police physicals. Her arm simply couldn't do what the job required. For some people, that would have been the end of the story, but not for Samantha Dean. Instead of abandoning her dream of helping others, she found another way. If she couldn't be on the front lines as a police officer, she would be there for the people who needed help the most. Crime victims. She earned a master's degree in forensic psychology and began volunteering with the Austin Police Department. Eventually, she became the first victim services coordinator for the Kyle Police Department. Her colleagues would later remember her as a ray of light. She was compassionate with every single victim she helped. She created safe spaces for people in their darkest moments. In the words of her police chief, she provided a safe haven for those in stressful, painful, and sometimes dire situations. And perhaps most remarkably, given what she had been through, Samantha became pregnant. Her family hadn't been sure if she would ever be able to have children after all that radiation treatment. As her mother would later say, it was really a blessing that she was even able to become pregnant. Samantha was thrilled. She was going to be a mother. She had already picked out a name for her baby girl, Madeline. But there was a complication in this happy story. The father of her child didn't share her joy. The father was a 32-year-old Austin Police Department officer named Vontre Clark. Samantha and Vontre had met years earlier in San Antonio, where they both worked in non-police office jobs. That's when their relationship began, quietly and secretly. It would continue that way, on and off, for 6 or 7 years. A relationship conducted in shadows and stolen moments. As time went on, Vontre joined the Austin Police Department and became a sworn officer. Samantha volunteered at that same department before taking her full-time position in Kyle, but their relationship remained hidden because Vontre had another life. He lived with his longtime girlfriend, Laura Tootin, in a home that she owned. He had a family with her. When Samantha discovered she was pregnant in August 2014, everything changed. She told Vontre the news, and his reaction was not what she hoped. According to what Samantha wrote in her personal journal, a journal that investigators would later find in her South Austin home, Vontre insisted she get an abortion. He told her that his life would be ruined if she had the baby. He would lose his family. Everything he had built would come crashing down. But Samantha refused. She had survived cancer against the odds. This pregnancy was a miracle she never expected to have. She wanted this baby. In her journal, Samantha wrote something chilling. She wrote that she feared for her life. She wrote that she believed Vontre Clark was going to kill her. If she turned up dead, she wanted people to know who was responsible. Samantha's mother would later recall a conversation they had about the pregnancy. She said, "This isn't the way that I had wanted everything to be." And I said, "You have gone beyond anything that we could have ever expected of you. And we are so proud of you, and it's going to be okay." The Dean family began preparing for Maddie's arrival. They bought clothes, diapers, baby wipes. They were looking forward to welcoming a new life into their family. Samantha's sister Taylor would sit and read to the baby through Samantha's belly, feeling Maddie kick. The day before Samantha died, she went shopping for a car seat. Vontre Clark, meanwhile, was making very different preparations. Vontre Clark knew he couldn't kill Samantha himself. He was a police officer. He knew how investigations worked, how evidence was collected, how crimes were solved. If something happened to his pregnant girlfriend, he would be the first suspect. So he turned to an old friend from high school, a man named Kevin Watson. The two had known each other for about 15 years, meeting at Reagan High School in Austin. They had remained close over the years, the kind of friendship that endures from adolescence into adulthood. In late 2014 or early 2015, Vontre approached Kevin with a proposition. He needed Samantha Dean dead, and he was willing to pay $5,000 to make it happen. The reason, he said, was that Samantha wanted him to pay child support for the baby, and he couldn't let that happen. Kevin Watson listened to his old friend's request, and he agreed to help. But there was a problem. Neither Vontre nor Kevin felt they could actually commit the murder themselves. They needed someone else, someone who could pull the trigger. Kevin Watson knew someone who might be willing. His name was Freddie Lee Smith, and he would eventually become the man who ended Samantha Dean's life for $5,000. The three men began to plan, and being somewhat savvy about how police investigations work, they took precautions. Kevin Watson went to a Walmart in southwest Houston and bought a prepaid Verizon phone, a burner phone that couldn't be easily traced back to any of them. This phone would be used to communicate with Samantha, but the conspirators went even further. Vontre Clark and Kevin Watson also used their PlayStation 4 gaming systems to communicate about the killing. They thought this would be a clever way to avoid detection, since text messages and regular phone calls could be subpoenaed. Gaming systems seemed safer, more anonymous. They were wrong about that, but they didn't know it yet. The plan came together piece by piece. Vontre would lure Samantha to a remote location, somewhere outside of Austin, where they wouldn't be easily spotted. He would tell her that a friend or family member needed a ride. Samantha, always willing to help, would agree. Freddie Smith would be waiting. He would shoot her, and to throw off the investigation, they would stage the scene to look like a drug deal gone bad. They would plant marijuana in her car, make it look like she had been involved in something criminal, something that might explain why she was killed. The date was set, February 4th, 2015. On the evening of February 4th, Samantha Dean received a call on her phone. The phone that had been in communication with that prepaid Verizon phone, purchased by Kevin Watson. Vontre needed her help, the caller said. Someone, a friend or maybe a family member, needed a ride into Austin. Could she help out? Samantha, 7 months pregnant, and probably tired after a long day, nevertheless agreed. That's who she was. She helped people. It's what she did for a living, and it's who she was as a person. She got into her black Dodge Charger and drove to meet Vontre. The plan, he told her, was to drive out to Bastrop County to that vacant shopping center at 118 Stephen F. Austin Boulevard. It was about 25 miles southeast of Austin, past the city limits, past the suburbs into a more rural area. When they arrived at the shopping center, it was dark and deserted. The stores had been closed for hours. The parking lot was empty, except for one person. Freddie Lee Smith was there, waiting in the shadows. What happened next was brutal and quick. Freddie Smith shot Samantha Dean in the head. Then he shot her again. And then, according to evidence that would later emerge, Vontre Clark himself fired a shot into Samantha's body. 3 shots. one for Samantha, and two, in a terrible way, for the baby she carried. The conspirators then scattered marijuana in Samantha's car, trying to make the scene look like a drug transaction gone wrong. They left her body next to the vehicle, the door hanging open, and then they left. Kevin Watson, who had brokered this terrible deal, gave Freddie Smith a ride away from the scene. Cell phone data would later show that Watson's phone had been in the area at the time of the murder. Vontre Clark went back to his life, to his girlfriend Laura, to his job at the Austin Police Department. He must have thought he had gotten away with it. He must have believed that his careful planning, his use of burner phones and gaming systems, his staging of the scene, he must have thought all of that would be enough. It wasn't. When the deputy found Samantha's body just a few hours later, at 2 a.m., he immediately called for backup. By sunrise, the Bastrop County Sheriff's Office had launched a full investigation, and they were getting help from the Austin Police Department, since the victim had connections to law enforcement. The staged scene didn't fool investigators for long. They could tell something was off about it. The marijuana felt planted, not natural. And when they identified the victim as Samantha Dean, the victim services coordinator from Kyle, they knew this wasn't a random drug killing. They began looking into Samantha's life, her relationships, her recent activities, and that's when Vontre Clark's name surfaced. Search warrants were executed. Investigators found Samantha's journal with its desperate entries about Vontre wanting her to have an abortion and her fear that he might kill her. They interviewed Vontre, who admitted he had been in a secret relationship with Samantha and that he was the father of her unborn child. He admitted he had wanted her to terminate the pregnancy. In May 2015, investigators obtained a search warrant for Vontre Clark's home, the house he shared with Laura Tootin. They seized essentially every electronic device in the house: phones, computers, gaming systems. They took several pairs of shoes. They collected a DNA sample from Vontre. The day after Samantha's body was discovered, the Austin Police Department had placed Vontre on restricted duty. By March, Internal Affairs had officially opened an investigation into his connection to the murder. And as the evidence mounted, Vontre must have known that the walls were closing in. Then in June 2015, a breakthrough. A man named Aaron Williams came forward with information. He told detectives that his friend Kevin Watson had told him about a plot to kill Samantha Dean. According to Williams, Vontre Clark had been looking to pay someone $5,000 to kill both Samantha and her baby because she wanted him to pay child support. Williams revealed that Watson and Freddie Smith had carried out the murder, but that Clark had driven Samantha to the location in Bastrop County. The murder had been set up to look like a drug deal, just as investigators had suspected. Meanwhile, police had been monitoring jail phone calls from Kevin Watson, who was being held in Harris County on unrelated drug charges. In those calls, they heard Watson ask his girlfriend Kyla Fisk to get rid of a sweatshirt, the hoodie he had worn the night of the murder. Kyla Fisk was arrested for tampering with evidence after she told Watson she had already taken care of it. Cell phone records and surveillance footage began to paint a damning picture. On the day Samantha's body was discovered, Kevin Watson had been caught on camera at a Walmart in southwest Houston, buying that prepaid Verizon phone. That phone had communicated with Samantha, and its signal had registered in the area of the crime scene. The forensic evidence from the burner phones, the geolocation data, the PlayStation communications, all of it pointed to a carefully orchestrated conspiracy. Vontre Clark, Kevin Watson, and Freddie Smith had worked together to murder Samantha Dean and her unborn daughter. But by the time authorities were ready to arrest Vontre Clark, he was gone. In July 2015, Vontre Clark boarded a plane and flew to Bali, Indonesia, a tropical island paradise on the other side of the world. He did this without getting approval from his supervisors at the Austin Police Department. He simply disappeared. His attorney, Bristol Myers, would later claim that Clark went to Indonesia for medical reasons, that he needed treatment that could only be obtained there, but police saw it differently. They believed Clark had fled because he knew he was about to be arrested for capital murder. The Austin Police Department classified Clark as absent without leave. IDAWAL. When they couldn't contact him, they fired him. But this wasn't the end of the story. The FBI got involved, and they began working with Indonesian authorities to locate Clark. The United States didn't have an extradition treaty with Indonesia, which complicated matters. But eventually, the FBI found him. In August 2015, 5 months after Samantha's murder, Vontre Clark was taken into custody in Bali. Indonesian officials detained him on visa-related issues, and the FBI escorted him back to the United States. He was flown directly to Texas and taken to the Bastrop County Jail, where he was charged with capital murder. His old friend Kevin Watson was also charged with capital murder. Both men initially pleaded not guilty. It would take years for justice to fully unfold. Freddie Lee Smith wasn't arrested and charged until September 2019, more than 4 years after the murder. By that time, prosecutors had built an airtight case against all three men. In September 2019, Kevin Watson changed his plea. He agreed to plead guilty to murder. Not capital murder, but the lesser charge, in exchange for a sentence of 35 years. Part of his plea deal stipulated that he would testify against Freddie Smith, if called to do so. Then, in December 2019, something unexpected happened. Vontre Clark, who had initially pleaded not guilty and was facing a possible death sentence if convicted, suddenly reversed course. He signed a written confession. In that confession, which prosecutors read aloud in court, Clark finally told the truth about what happened. He admitted that in September 2014, he had wanted Samantha to terminate her pregnancy, but she refused. He admitted that he felt the pregnancy threatened his existing family. He admitted that he contacted Kevin Watson to help coordinate Samantha's murder. When it became clear that neither of us could kill her ourselves, Clark wrote, Watson connected me with Freddie Smith, who agreed to kill and did kill Samantha Dean in exchange for a fee. Clark confessed to luring Samantha to Bastrop under false pretenses, telling her that someone needed a ride. He confessed that he and Watson had schemed to make the murder scene look like a drug deal gone bad. And while he claimed he did not pull the trigger, he accepted responsibility for his role in the murder of Samantha and their unborn child, Madeline. On December 16, 2019, Vontre Clark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He waived his right to appeal. At the sentencing hearing, Samantha's family finally had their chance to speak directly to the man who had destroyed their lives. Samantha's sister, Taylor, stood before the court and addressed Clark. "You stole my favorite person," she said. "Someone I was lucky enough to know for 21.5 years. She was always one of my biggest cheerleaders. She was my comedian, a person to always laugh and make me smile. You stole an innocent child. You stole my niece." Madeline was cherished. "I valued the moments I could sit and read to her and wanting to feel her kick." She called Clark a self-serving coward and a narcissist. Samantha's mother, Kimberly Dean, spoke next. She told Clark about her daughter's courage in surviving cancer. "She was a feisty and rambunctious child," she said. "She was smart, independent, loyal, compassionate, loving, and true." She spoke about the 1776 days since she had last talked to her daughter. They used to call each other every morning on their way to work. Those conversations had been a highlight of her days, and now they were gone forever. "You took away everything when you took Sammy away," Kimberly said. There would never be closure or moving on from what Clark did to their family when he decided to have Samantha and Madeline murdered for $5,000. She told Clark that his unborn daughter, Madeline, was a gift from God who would have loved him unconditionally. "You killed 2 innocent people," she said, "and now you will truly live out the rest of your life as a sorry father and a pathetic human being." In 2022, Freddie Lee Smith went to trial. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty for capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. All 3 men, Vontre Clark, Kevin Watson, and Freddie Lee Smith, are now in prison, and they will remain there for the rest of their lives. 10 years after her death, in February 2025, the Kyle Police Department held a dedication ceremony. They named their victim services Soft Interview Room Samantha Space and the waiting area Maddie's Corner, ensuring that Samantha Dean and her daughter would be remembered by every person who came seeking help. The current victim services coordinator, Kelly Barron, spoke about Samantha's legacy. "She was just a ray of light around here," she said. In just a very short time, she made a huge impact not only on the Kyle Police Department, but on the city of Kyle. In one of the most poignant gestures, the Kyle Police Department helped posthumously fulfill Samantha's dream of becoming a police officer. A dream that cancer had taken from her, but that her courage and dedication had transformed into something equally meaningful. Samantha's parents, Kelvin and Kimberly Dean, have spent the past decade quietly advocating on their daughter's behalf. They've watched Samantha's friends get married, have children, advance in their careers, become grandparents. And every time they can't help but think about what Samantha would be doing now, what kind of mother she would have been, what kind of grandmother they would have been to Maddie. Last year, in an act of extraordinary courage, Kimberly Dean drove to a rural East Texas prison to meet with Vontre Clark. She wanted to understand from the perspective of someone Samantha had loved, how he could have done what he did, not only to Samantha, but to their granddaughter, to his own daughter. Samantha's mother left one final message about her daughter. This was her job. She knew very well what domestic violence looks like. It's a haunting irony. Samantha Dean dedicated her life to helping victims of violence. She knew the warning signs. She had written in her journal that she feared Vontre might kill her. She understood domestic violence in all its forms. And yet, even with all that knowledge, even with all her training and experience, she couldn't save herself from becoming a victim of the very thing she fought against. And so we come to the end of this story, here in the quiet darkness where true crime stories find their rest. Samantha Dean was 29 years old when she died. She was 7 months pregnant with a baby girl named Madeline. She was a cancer survivor who had turned her broken dreams into a mission to help others. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and an expectant mother. She was killed by the father of her child, who paid $5,000 to have her murdered because she refused to have an abortion. 3 men conspired to end her life in a vacant parking lot in Bastrop, Texas, on a cold February night in 2015. Her family will never get to hold Madeline. They'll never see what kind of woman Samantha would have become in her 30s, 40s, 50s. They'll never experience the joy of watching her raise her daughter. But Samantha's legacy lives on in the victims who continue to be helped in spaces that now bear her name, in the friends and family who remember her light and laughter, and in the story of her courage, both in surviving cancer and in refusing to give up the child she wanted so desperately. In the Kyle Police Department, there is now a room called Samantha's Space, where victims of crime can find safety and comfort. Just outside, there's a waiting area called Maddie's Corner, where people sit before they're called in for help. 2 names, a mother and daughter who never got to meet, but whose memory ensures that countless others might find the help they need in their darkest moments. Rest now, Samantha. Rest now, Maddie. Your story has been told, and you will not be forgotten. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the quiet market town of Tamworth, in England's West Midlands, September 2019 should have been a time of celebration and new beginnings for 20-year-old Keely Bunker. She had just marked her 20th birthday days earlier, and her future seemed bright with possibility. She was a young woman known for her kindness, her infectious smile, and her dream of becoming a teaching assistant, working with children and making a difference in their lives. But the night of September 18th would become the last night of Keely's life. What began as a birthday celebration with friends would end in a tragedy that would shake the entire community of Tamworth to its core. This is the story of trust betrayed, of a friendship that masked something far more sinister, and of a family's desperate search that ended in the most devastating discovery imaginable. To understand what was lost that September night, we need to understand who Keely Bunker was. At 4 feet 11 inches tall and weighing just 91 pounds, Keely was petite in stature but enormous in spirit. Those who knew her described her as one of the most vibrant, caring, and beautiful souls they had ever met. She worked as a barmaid in Tamworth, but her heart was set on something more. She longed to work with children, to help educate young minds and make a positive impact on the next generation. Keely lived with her family in Tamworth, a town with a population of about 75,000, located in Staffordshire. It's the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where childhood friendships stretch into adulthood, where trust runs deep in the fabric of the community. Keely had grown up there, attended school there, built her life there, and she had friends there, friends she had known since she was a child, friends she trusted completely. One of those friends was Wesley Street. Wesley and Keely had known each other since junior school. They had grown up in the same neighborhood, shared the same streets, the same familiar places. Wesley lived close to Keely's family home, just a short walk away. He was someone Keely considered a friend, someone her family knew. someone who seemed like a regular young man trying to find his way in life. He had once held a football scholarship for Litchfield and Tamworth, a point of pride though that had ended when he stopped playing. He worked as a warehouse packer for the online shopping company Ocado. To those who knew him casually, Wesley seemed like just another young man in Tamworth. But beneath the surface, there was something darker that no one could see. On September 6, 2019, Keely turned 20. It was a milestone birthday, one that marks the threshold between adolescence and true adulthood. Like many young people, Keely wanted to celebrate, and when she learned that one of her favorite artists, a rapper named H, would be performing at the O2 Institute in Birmingham, she knew exactly how she wanted to mark the occasion. Birmingham is only about 20 miles from Tamworth, close enough for a night out, but far enough to feel like an adventure. Keely made plans to go to the concert with her close friend Monique Riggin. The two young women were good friends who lived near each other in Tamworth. They were excited about the concert, about dressing up, about having a night out in the city. Just days before the concert, Keely had tweeted her excitement, writing, "Only thing keeping me going is seeing H on Wednesday. Hopefully he'll see me and we'll get married XOX." It was the kind of playful, innocent post that captured Keely's youthful energy and sense of humor. Wednesday, September 18th arrived, and Keely and Monique made their way to Birmingham. The concert was everything they had hoped for. The music loud and energetic, the crowd electric, the atmosphere intoxicating. For a few hours, Keely was lost in the moment, singing along, dancing, celebrating her birthday in the way she had imagined. The world felt full of possibility that night. After the concert ended, Keely and Monique met up with Wesley Street at Birmingham's New Street station. They had arranged to continue the celebration by going to Snob's nightclub, a popular Birmingham venue. The three friends entered the club together around 11:30 that night. They danced, they drank, they laughed. But while Keely and Monique were having a few drinks and pacing themselves, Wesley was drinking heavily. According to Monique, for every drink the girls had, Wesley had 3. He was downing double vodka, Red Bulls, drinking quickly and steadily. By the time they left the club at 2:40 in the morning, Wesley was very drunk. He was so intoxicated that he felt sick during the taxi ride home. The taxi dropped all 3 of them off at Monique's house in Tamworth around 3:30 in the morning. It was late, the streets were quiet, and the sensible thing to do would have been to stay put for the night. Monique offered Keely a bed for the night. She suggested that Keely could sleep there and walk home later in the morning, when it was light outside, when she was more rested. But Keely declined the offer. She was tired, she explained, but she had something important happening later that day, a job interview for a teaching assistant position. It was the job she really wanted, the job that aligned with her dreams of working with children. She wanted to get some proper sleep in her own bed so she would be fresh for the interview. "I've got Wes," Keely told Monique. "Wes lives near me. Wes will walk me back. It'll be fine." It seemed like a perfectly reasonable plan. Wesley lived very close to Keely's house, practically on the same route. They had known each other since they were children. He was a trusted friend, someone who had walked these same streets hundreds of times. Monique felt reassured. Before Keely and Wesley left, Monique asked Wesley to make sure to look after Keely, to make sure she got home safely. Wesley promised he would. He told Monique that he would make sure Keely got home safely. At around 4 o'clock in the morning, Keely Bunker and Wesley Street left Monique's house and began walking toward Keely's home. The walk should have taken about 20 minutes. It was a route both of them knew well, through the center of Tamworth, past familiar landmarks, through quiet streets where most people were asleep in their beds. Keely Bunker would never make it home. As Thursday, September 19th, wore on, Keely's family began to worry. She hadn't come home from her night out. She hadn't shown up for her job interview. She wasn't answering her phone. For a young woman who was responsible and kept in touch with her family, the silence was alarming. This wasn't like Keely. Something was wrong. At 5:30 that afternoon, Keely's father, Christopher Bunker, reported his daughter missing to the police. The moment every parent dreads had arrived. The moment when worry turns to genuine fear. When you have to speak the words out loud. "My daughter is missing." The police immediately began their investigation. They spoke to Keely's friends, trying to piece together her movements from the night before. They learned about the concert, about the nightclub, about the taxi ride back to Tamworth. And they learned something crucial. The last person reported to have seen Keely alive was Wesley Street. Officers tracked down Wesley and asked him what had happened. Wesley seemed cooperative. He told them that he and Keely had walked some of the way home together, but that they had gone their separate ways when they reached a telephone box near his home, at the junction of Massafield Drive and Wordsworth Avenue. That Wesley said was the last time he had seen Keely. She was alive when they parted ways. He had walked on toward his house and she had continued toward hers. He assumed she had made it home safely. To demonstrate his helpfulness, Wesley even offered to show the police the exact route they had taken. He got into a police car with officers and rode along, pointing out the path they had walked, showing them the telephone box where they had supposedly parted ways. He seemed willing to help, but there was something else. Something Wesley seemed reluctant to do. When police asked for his mobile phone, he didn't want to give it to them. He hesitated, resisted. While Wesley was showing police the route he claimed to have taken, Keely's family and friends were not sitting idle. They organized their own search party, dozens of people fanning out across Tamworth, looking for any sign of Keely. They searched streets, alleyways, parks, anywhere she might have gone. The hours ticked by with no sign of her. The sun began to set. The search grew more desperate, and then just a few hours after Keely had been officially reported missing, a scream tore through the evening air in Wigginton Park. It was a scream that would haunt everyone who heard it. A sound of pure anguish and horror. One member of the search party would later describe it as the most horrendous scream or shout I've ever heard in my life. The scream came from Jason Brown, Keely's uncle. He had been searching the park with his torch, sweeping the beam across the ground, looking behind bushes and trees, and then his torch beam caught something. The glint of a bracelet on an arm, hair floating in water. Jason had found Keely. She was lying face down in a brook, a shallow pool of water near the edge of Wigginton Park. Her body was partially submerged. Someone had tried to conceal her by covering her with branches. Her black leggings and underwear had been pulled down and were twisted around her ankles. The scene told a horrific story even before the medical examination could confirm. At 9 o'clock that night, September 19th, just over 15 hours after Keely had left Monique's house with Wesley Street, just 4 hours after her father had reported her missing, Keely's body was found. The birthday celebration that had begun with such joy and promise had ended in the most brutal way imaginable. Within hours of the discovery, at around 11 o'clock that night, Wesley Street was arrested. When police took him into custody, they noticed scratches on his face. Fresh scratches. The kind of scratches that come from a struggle. Wesley Street's first story, the one about parting ways with Keely at the telephone box, was already starting to unravel. But it would take forensic evidence, technology, and painstaking police work to reveal just how many lies Wesley had told. The post-mortem examination revealed the brutal truth. Keely had been raped. She had been strangled to death. The medical examiner determined that she had died from sustained pressure around her neck, consistent with a chokehold. The pressure had been maintained for several minutes, long enough that it could not have been accidental. Long enough that Keely would have struggled, fought, tried desperately to breathe. The scratches found on her neck were self-inflicted. Forensic analysis found samples of her own skin under her fingernails. She had clawed at her own neck, trying frantically to loosen the grip that was killing her, trying to get air into her lungs, trying to survive. Wesley Street's DNA was found on Keely's body. The evidence was incontrovertible. He had raped her before killing her. But the lies Wesley had told were systematic and calculated. He had crafted a story designed to distance himself from the crime, to make it seem like he had left Keely alive and well. However, modern technology would prove to be his undoing. Expert analysis of Wesley's mobile phone told a very different story than the one he had given police. GPS data from his phone showed that he had not walked to the telephone box and then gone home, as he claimed. Instead, his phone's movements showed that he had gone away from his home and into Wigginton Park, the exact location where Keely's body was found. His phone had been in the area where Keely died for approximately 1 hour on the morning of her death. But even more damning, the GPS data showed that his phone had been at that same location 7 times throughout the day on September 19th. The day Keely was missing, the day her family and friends were desperately searching for her. Wesley had returned to the scene multiple times. He had gone back to where he had hidden Keely's body, perhaps checking to make sure it was still concealed. Perhaps drawn back by guilt or fear or the need to see if his crime had been discovered. CCTV footage added more pieces to the puzzle. Cameras had captured Keely and Wesley walking together near Tamworth Rugby Club at 4:23 in the morning. This was nowhere near the telephone box where Wesley claimed they had parted ways. The footage showed them walking together, moving toward Wigginton Park. Some of the footage appeared to show Wesley with his arms around Keely, around the lower part of her face, around her neck. The prosecution would later argue that this footage showed Keely trying to get away from him, not two friends walking companionably home together. Physical evidence told more of the story. Keely's rucksack was found a short distance from Tamworth Rugby Club. Wesley's bank card was discovered between the rugby club and where Keely's body was found, a trail of evidence showing his movements. His jacket, also found in the park, was heavily stained on the lower parts of both sleeves with makeup that matched what Keely had been wearing that night. The evidence was overwhelming. Wesley Street had not parted ways with Keely at a telephone box. He had walked her into Wigginton Park, probably under the pretext of stopping for a cigarette or taking a different route. And once they were in that isolated park in the darkness of the early morning hours, he had attacked her, he had raped her, and he had killed her by choking her for several minutes while she struggled and fought for her life. After Keely was dead, Wesley had dragged her body to the brook, dumped her face down in the water, and covered her with branches in an attempt to hide what he had done. Then, according to court testimony, he had simply walked home to his house and gone to bed. He had slept while Keely's family began to worry about her. He had slept while her father reported her missing. He had slept while search parties formed to look for her. And when he woke up, he began his campaign of lies. As the investigation into Keely's murder deepened, something else emerged. Something that painted an even more disturbing picture of Wesley Street. He had done this before, not murder, but sexual violence. Keely was not his first victim. 3 young women came forward with allegations against Wesley. Their stories revealed a pattern of sexual violence that had gone unchecked for years. A series of attacks that had escalated until finally reaching the horror of Keely's murder. The first incident dated back to 2015, when Wesley was just 15 years old. He had raped and sexually assaulted a 16-year-old girl. 2 years later, in 2017, he sexually assaulted a 15-year-old girl. And in 2019, the same year he murdered Keely, he raped another 20-year-old woman. These were not isolated incidents or misunderstandings. They were part of a deliberate pattern of predatory behavior. The 3 women who came forward showed tremendous bravery. Detective Inspector Cheryl Hannon of Staffordshire Police's Major Investigations Department would later praise their courage, saying they had shown incredible bravery throughout the investigation and trial. Coming forward about sexual assault is never easy, and doing so in the midst of a murder investigation, with all the public attention that brings, required exceptional strength. The pattern that emerged was chilling. Wesley Street did not accept rejection. He did not accept the word no. When women refused his sexual advances, he took what he wanted by force. The prosecution would argue at trial that this was exactly what had happened with Keely. She had only ever viewed Wesley as a friend. She trusted him, had known him since childhood, saw him as someone safe to walk home with. But Wesley wanted more. And when Keely rejected his advances because she surely must have, there in the dark of Wigginton Park, he did not accept her refusal. He raped her. And then, perhaps because she knew him, perhaps because she could identify him, perhaps simply because he could, he killed her. Wesley Street was charged with the rape and murder of Keely Bunker, as well as 2 additional counts of rape, 3 counts of sexual assault, and 1 charge of sexual activity with a child relating to the 3 other victims. He denied all charges. The trial began at Stafford Crown Court in July 2020. Over the course of the proceedings, Wesley would change his story multiple times, crafting new versions of events, as each lie was exposed by evidence. In total, he gave 4 different accounts of what had happened that night before finally settling on a version to present at trial. His final story, the one he told when he took the witness stand in his own defense, was perhaps the most calculated of all. Wesley admitted that Keely had died in Wigginton Park. He admitted that he had been with her when she died. He admitted that he had put his arms around her neck. He admitted that he had put her body in the brook and covered it with branches. He admitted lying to her family, to her friends, to the police. But he claimed it was all an accident. According to Wesley's trial testimony, he and Keely had started flirting as they walked home together. Not physical flirting, he was careful to say, just looking at each other in a flirtatious way. He claimed they had engaged in play fighting near the entrance to the park. The very scene that prosecution argued showed Keely trying to escape. He said they went into the park and began having consensual sex. And during that sex, he said he had his forearm around her neck and she went floppy. He claimed he had accidentally killed her, that he panicked, that he was scared and embarrassed. And that was why he lied and hid her body. The prosecution dismantled this story piece by piece. Jacob Hallam QC, presenting the Crown's case, pointed out the calculated nature of Wesley's lies, how each version of his story had been tailored to fit the evidence as it emerged. When phone data proved he had gone into the park, he admitted going into the park but claimed they parted ways there. When DNA proved sexual contact, he claimed it was consensual. When the evidence of strangulation was undeniable, he claimed it was an accident. But the evidence told a different story. The medical evidence showed that Keely had been subjected to sustained pressure around her neck for 2 to 3 minutes. To lose consciousness from strangulation takes 10 to 15 seconds. But to kill someone requires maintaining that pressure for much longer. Long enough that it could not possibly be accidental. Long enough that the person doing the strangling would feel the victim struggling, fighting, trying to breathe. The scratches on Keely's neck, self-inflicted as she desperately tried to loosen Wesley's grip, told of a young woman fighting for her life. The prosecution's case was that Keely had never wanted anything sexual with Wesley. She viewed him only as a friend. When he made advances in the park, she rejected him, and Wesley, who had a history of not accepting rejection from women, who had a pattern of taking what he wanted by force, raped her. Then he strangled her, possibly to silence her, possibly because he enjoyed the power, possibly simply because he could. The murder was not an accident during consensual sex. It was the deliberate killing of a young woman who had trusted him, who had told her friend, "I've got Wes will walk me back. It'll be fine." The jury heard testimony about Wesley's behavior after the murder. He had not panicked. He had not been so scared that he couldn't think straight. Instead, he had been calculating and methodical. He had hidden Keely's body carefully, covering it with branches. He had walked home and gone to sleep. The next day, while Keely's family desperately searched for her, he had maintained his lies. He had even looked Keely's uncle, Jason Brown, in the eye hours. Before Jason found Keely's body and lied to him about where he had last seen her, knowing full well that her body was nearby in Wigginton Park. When confronted about this moment in court, Wesley simply said, "I couldn't tell him that I'd slept with her and accidentally strangled her. I just went with it." There was no remorse in those words. Just a cold explanation of his decision to continue lying. The jury deliberated for approximately 8 hours. On August 5th, 2020, they returned their verdict. Guilty. Wesley Street was found guilty of the rape and murder of Keely Bunker. He was also found guilty of 2 additional counts of rape and 3 counts of sexual assault relating to his other victims. 2 days later, on August 7th, 2020, Wesley Street stood before Mr. Justice Jeremy Baker for sentencing. The courtroom was filled with Keely's family and friends, people who had loved her and were now left to grapple with the enormity of what had been taken from them. The judge's words were measured, but devastating in their assessment of Wesley's crimes and character. He described Wesley as truly evil, a phrase not used lightly in a court of law. He spoke of the carefully crafted scheme of lies Wesley had employed following his crime, how each lie had been tailored to fit the evidence as it emerged during the investigation. Mr. Justice Baker addressed the impact on Keely's family directly. "I am aware that no sentence which is imposed in relation to the offense of murder will assuage the feelings of devastation, grief, and loss suffered by Keely Bunker's family and those who loved her. It is clear that not only was she loved by so many, but that Keely was one of the most kindest, caring of individuals. Moreover, not only has she lost the opportunity of fulfilling her life ambition, helping to educate young children, her family have lost the company of their beloved daughter, sister, and niece." Then the judge detailed what he believed had happened that night in Wigginton Park. "What took place in Wigginton Park is you proceeded to rape Keely Bunker, in the course of which you murdered her by throttling her, in all probability by placing her in a chokehold for a sufficient period of time to kill her." He emphasized that the chokehold would have lasted minutes rather than seconds. And then he described what Wesley did after Keely was dead. "When you had finished with her, you decided to hide Keely's now lifeless body by depositing it in the brook. covering it up with branches. You then walked back to your home, went to bed, and slept. Wesley Street was sentenced to life in prison. The judge set a minimum term of 30 years before Wesley could even be considered for parole. Though he reduced this by the 319 days Wesley had already spent in custody awaiting trial, meaning he would serve a minimum of 29 years and 46 days. But the judge made clear that this was only a minimum, and that Wesley might never be released. You may never be released, as that will only occur if and when the parole board is satisfied it is no longer necessary for the protection of the public that you should be confined. For the rape and sexual assault charges relating to his other victims, Wesley received additional concurrent sentences. The message was clear. Wesley Street was a dangerous predator who had caused immeasurable harm to multiple young women, and society needed to be protected from him. In the wake of the verdict and sentencing, Keely's family struggled to put their grief and anger into words. Her mother, Debbie Watkins, spoke of how the family would never forgive Wesley for what he had done, for murdering her daughter and then forcing them to sit through a 4-week trial where they had to hear harrowing details of Keely's final moments. The trial had been its own form of torture, a prolonged agony where the family had to relive Keely's death again and again through testimony and evidence. Keely's father, Christopher Bunker, described how their once happy family home was now filled with sadness and emptiness, since his daughter had been cruelly taken. The simple pleasures of family life, meals together, conversations, laughter were now haunted by Keely's absence. Keely's sister spoke of losing one of the most vibrant, caring, and beautiful souls this earth has ever seen. She remembered Keely's kindness, her dreams, her desire to help children learn and grow. All of that potential, all of those dreams, had been extinguished in a few brutal minutes in a dark park. The Crown Prosecution Service released a statement saying, "Wesley Street will now face the consequences of his truly evil actions." Detective Inspector Cheryl Hannon emphasized that Wesley Street, and Wesley Street alone, was responsible for Keely's untimely death. She spoke of the audacity and arrogance Wesley displayed in his lies, how he had played the martyr, asking why people were blaming him when he claimed to have left Keely at the phone box, all while knowing exactly where she was and what he had done to her, and what efforts he had made to conceal her body. For Monique Riggin, Keely's friend who had last seen her alive, there was undoubtedly a burden of guilt to carry, however undeserved. She had asked Wesley to look after Keely to make sure she got home safely. He had promised to do so. Monique had trusted him, just as Keely had trusted him. How could either of them have known what he truly was? How could anyone have predicted that a childhood friend would become a murderer? The tragedy was not just in Keely's death, but in the betrayal of trust that made that death possible. The community of Tamworth was shaken by the murder. This was not a story of a stranger attacking someone in the dark. This was someone they knew, someone who had grown up in their streets, someone who had seemed normal. It forced difficult conversations about recognizing warning signs, about believing victims who come forward with accusations of sexual assault, about the hidden nature of predatory behavior. The 3 women who came forward with their own stories of sexual assault by Wesley Street were vindicated by the verdict, though that vindication came at a terrible price. Their trauma was real. Their accusations were true, and perhaps if someone had listened earlier, if Wesley had faced consequences for his earlier crimes, Keely might still be alive. But there is no comfort in such speculation, only more pain. The murder of Keely Bunker forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, about friendship, about the masks that dangerous people wear. Wesley Street was not a stranger lurking in shadows. He was a friend since childhood, someone who lived nearby, someone who seemed safe. Keely had no reason to fear him. No one did, until it was too late. The case also highlights the importance of taking sexual assault allegations seriously. Wesley had sexually assaulted and raped other women before he killed Keely. There was a pattern of predatory behavior, an escalation of violence. Each time he was able to commit these acts without facing consequences, he became more emboldened, more dangerous. The criminal justice system failed his earlier victims, and ultimately that failure contributed to Keely's death. In the quiet hours of the night, when we think about Keely's story, we might imagine those final moments. A young woman, barely into adulthood, walking home in the early morning darkness with someone she trusted. Perhaps she was tired. Perhaps she was talking about her upcoming job interview. Perhaps she was simply ready to get home and sleep in her own bed. And then the shift, the moment when a trusted friend became something else, when the walk home became a nightmare, when trust became the weapon used against her. We think about her fighting for her life, clawing at her own neck, trying desperately to breathe, to survive, to live the life she had barely begun. We think about her dreams of working with children, dreams that would never be realized. We think about her family, waiting for her to come home, not knowing that she never would. Wesley Street took all of that away in a few minutes of violence. He took Keely's life, her future, her dreams. He took a daughter from her parents, a sister from her siblings, a niece from her uncle, a friend from her friends. He took a young woman who wanted to make the world better for children and made sure she would never have that chance. And then he went home and slept. That final detail is perhaps the most chilling of all. Not the violence itself, horrible as it was, but the coldness that followed. The ability to sleep after taking a life. The ability to lie to grieving family members. The ability to maintain deception while search parties desperately looked for someone he knew was already dead. Hidden beneath branches in a brook. Keely Bunker's life was cut tragically short at the age of 20. She never got to have that job interview she was preparing for. She never got to become the teaching assistant she dreamed of being. She never got to experience the fullness of adulthood. To find love, to build a career, to have her own family, to grow old. Instead, Keely is forever 20, forever young, forever remembered not for the life she lived, but for the horrific way it ended. Her name is now permanently linked to her murder. Her story told in courts and true crime accounts, when it should have been told through years of friendship, accomplishment, and joy. The town of Tamworth carries the weight of this tragedy. Wigginton Park, once just another green space in the town, is now marked by what happened there. The rugby club, phone box, the streets where Keely walked that last night. They are all part of the geography of this crime now. Landmarks and a story no one wanted to tell. Wesley Street sits in prison, where he will remain for decades, possibly for the rest of his life. The law has done what it can to hold him accountable, to remove him from society, where he can do no more harm. But no amount of time in prison can undo what he did. It cannot bring Keely back. It cannot heal her family's grief. It cannot erase the trauma experienced by his other victims. It cannot restore the innocence and sense of safety that was shattered in Tamworth that September night. What remains is memory. The memory of a kind young woman who wanted to help children learn. The memory of a trusted friendship that turned out to be a deadly lie. The memory of a birthday celebration that ended in unimaginable tragedy. And the reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person is the one we never suspect at all. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.